Welcome to another video on stories of our history. The story of the Norman conquest of southern Italy and Sicily begins not in the sun-baked hills of the Mezzogiorno, but on the wind-swept, sea-lashed coast of northern France, in the Duchy of Normandy, a land that was itself a testament to the extraordinary capacity of the Viking people to transform themselves from pagan sea raiders into the most formidable Christian warriors of the medieval world. In the year 911 of the Christian era, the Frankish king Charles the Simple, exhausted by decades of devastating Viking raids along the Seine and the Loire, made a fateful and historic agreement with a Norse chieftain named Rollo, a man of immense stature and implacable will, who was, according to the later sagas, a relative of the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok. The Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte granted Rollo and his followers a vast territory in the lower Seine valley, the land that would become known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen, in exchange for their conversion to Christianity, their feudal oath of loyalty to the Frankish crown, and their solemn promise to defend the kingdom against any future Viking incursions. The Norsemen who settled in this fertile, rolling countryside did not simply vanish into the mass of the Frankish population. They engaged in a process of rapid, profound, and remarkably successful acculturation, adopting the language, the religion, and the feudal institutions of their new homeland, but preserving, in their genes and in their cultural memory, the ferocious warrior ethos, the maritime expertise, and the insatiable ambition that had driven their ancestors to cross the North Sea in their dragon-prowed longships. Within a few generations, the Normans had become the most feared and the most sought-after heavy cavalry in all of Christendom, their knights, clad in chain mail and armed with the long lance and the straight, double-edged sword, charging in a tight, disciplined formation that could shatter any infantry line and overwhelm any opposing cavalry force. The Norman state, which was consolidated by Rollo's descendants, particularly Duke William Longsword and Duke Richard the Fearless, was a model of centralized, efficient feudalism, a realm where the duke's authority was absolute, where the castles were numerous and well garrisoned, and where the church was a loyal instrument of state policy. It was from this crucible of military innovation and political ambition that the next great wave of Norman expansion would erupt, not toward the cold, familiar waters of the North Sea, but toward the warm, fragmented, and fabulously wealthy lands of the Mediterranean, a migration that would, within the span of a single century, transform the balance of power in the entire region and create a kingdom that was, in its cultural brilliance and its administrative sophistication, without parallel in the medieval world. The specific catalyst for the Norman arrival in southern Italy, which began in the early decades of the 11th century, was a combination of demographic pressure, political instability, and the eternal allure of mercenary service in a land that was rich, divided, and perpetually at war. The Duchy of Normandy, for all its prosperity, was a relatively small, densely populated territory, and the system of inheritance, which favored the eldest son, left a large, restless, and landless population of younger sons who had been trained from birth in the arts of war and who possessed nothing but their swords, their horses, and their burning desire for a fief of their own. The political landscape of southern Italy, which these young Norman adventurers began to explore, was a bewildering, chaotic patchwork of rival states and conflicting jurisdictions, a land that had been contested for centuries by the great powers of the Mediterranean and that had, as a result, become a paradise for the mercenary and the opportunist. The Lombard duchies of Benevento, Capua, and Salerno, which were the remnants of the old Lombard kingdom that had been conquered by Charlemagne, were locked in a constant, internecine struggle for survival against the encroaching power of the Byzantine Empire, which still controlled the coastal cities of Apulia and Calabria, and the rising threat of the Muslim emirs of Sicily, who, from their impregnable capital of Palermo, launched devastating annual raids along the coasts of the mainland. The local population, a complex mixture of Lombard, Greek, and Italo-Roman stock, was accustomed to the presence of foreign soldiers, and the Norman knights, with their towering stature, their fair hair, and their terrifying, disciplined ferocity in battle, were welcomed, initially, as a godsend by the Lombard princes who needed a new, decisive weapon to deploy against their myriad enemies. The arrival of the first Norman mercenaries in the early 1000s, particularly the bands that gathered around the charismatic and ambitious leader Rainulf Drengit, who would eventually be granted the county of Aversa in 1030 as a reward for his service, established a crucial, permanent Norman bridgehead on the Italian peninsula, a magnet that would draw, over the following decades, a steady stream of landless knights, adventurous nobles, and ambitious younger sons from the villages and the castles of Normandy, all of them seeking the same elusive prize, a land to call their own, a fief that they could conquer, hold, and bequeath to their own sons, transforming themselves from penniless mercenaries into the lords of a new, Norman world. It was into this chaotic, promising, and utterly ruthless environment that the Hautevilles brothers, the sons of a minor Norman baron named Tancred of Hauteville, would step, and their arrival would mark the beginning of the most extraordinary chapter in the long, blood-soaked history of the Norman expansion. A chapter that would culminate in the creation of a kingdom that united the sword of the north with the learning of the east and the gold of the south, a kingdom that was the ultimate, dazzling, and improbable legacy of the Viking Age. The southern Italy that the first Norman mercenaries encountered in the first half of the 11th century was a world of profound, almost unimaginable complexity and fragmentation, a geopolitical kaleidoscope whose shifting, clashing colors were the product of over 500 years of invasion, migration, and cultural layering, a land where the ruins of the Roman Empire coexisted, in a state of constant tension and intermittent violence, with the fortified monasteries of the Byzantine Greeks, the walled castelli of the Lombard nobility, and the gleaming, whitewashed mosques of the Saracen corsairs. The physical and political geography of the region, which the Romans had called Magna Graecia, the Great Greece, and which the Byzantines still referred to as the theme of Langobardia and the Cotentin of Italy, was defined by the towering, rugged spine of the Apennine Mountains, which ran, like a jagged, rocky backbone, down the center of the peninsula, separating the narrow, fertile coastal plains of the Adriatic and the Tyrrhenian from the vast, arid, and malarial plateau of the interior. The population, which was one of the most ethnically and religiously diverse in all of Christendom, reflected the successive waves of conquest and colonization that had swept over the land since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Greek-speaking population, which was concentrated in the coastal cities of Apulia, Calabria, and the Salento, remained fiercely loyal to the Orthodox Church and to the distant, but still potent, authority of the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople, who was represented, in Bari, the capital of the Cotentin, by a series of military governors, the Catepans, who commanded a small, but professional, army of local levies and Varangian mercenaries. The Lombard population, which was the dominant element in the interior principalities of Benevento, Capua, and Salerno, was the remnant of the Germanic tribes that had invaded Italy in the 6th century and had established a powerful kingdom that had, in its turn, been conquered by the Franks of Charlemagne in 774, leaving behind a legacy of independent-minded dukes, a Latin Rite clergy, and a distinctive legal tradition that was based on the ancient Lombard codes. The Muslim presence on the mainland, which was the result of over a century of raiding and settlement by the Aghlabid and Kalbid emirs of Sicily, was concentrated in a series of formidable, fortified strongholds, such as the mountain fortress of Fraxinetum in Provence and the coastal enclave of Bari, which had been, for a brief, humiliating period in the 840s, a Muslim emirate. A base from which the Saracen corsairs could strike deep into the interior and threaten the very heart of the Lombard duchies. The political relations between these three, mutually antagonistic blocs were a constantly shifting pattern of opportunistic alliances, bitter betrayals, and low-intensity warfare that had, over the centuries, created a deeply militarized, profoundly insecure society, a society in which every village was fortified, every landowner maintained his own private army, and every political dispute was, ultimately, resolved by the sword. It was into this volatile, chaotic, and immensely promising environment that the Norman mercenaries, with their discipline, their heavy cavalry, and their insatiable hunger for land, inserted themselves as a new, disruptive, and within a very short time, dominant force, a force that would, by the end of the 11th century, have swept away the last vestiges of Byzantine authority, reduced the Lombard princes to the status of vassals, and expelled the Muslims from their mainland strongholds, setting the stage for the even more audacious and spectacular conquest of the island of Sicily, the greatest jewel of the central Mediterranean. The arrival of the Hautevilles brothers, the sons of Tancred, was the catalyst that would transform the Norman presence in Italy from a loose, opportunistic collection of mercenary bands into a coherent, centrally directed, and politically astute project of territorial conquest and state building, a project that would, in the hands of Robert Guiscard, the most brilliant and the most ruthless of all the Norman leaders, redraw the map of the Mediterranean and alter the balance of power between the Latin West and the Byzantine East for centuries to come. The precise circumstances of the first Norman arrival in southern Italy are shrouded in a mixture of pious legend and heroic saga, a narrative that was carefully cultivated by the Norman chroniclers of the subsequent generation to provide a providential, divinely ordained justification for the conquest that they were in the process of completing, and the most famous, and the most enduring of these foundation myths is the story of the Norman pilgrims and the Saracen siege of Salerno. The tale, which is recorded in the Chronicle of Amadis of Monte Cassino, the History of the Normans, which was written in the late 11th century under the patronage of the abbot Desiderius, relates that, in or around the year 999, a group of Norman knights, returning from a pilgrimage to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, landed at the port of Salerno, a prosperous, independent Lombard principality that was, at that very moment, under a devastating siege by a large, well-equipped fleet of Saracen corsairs from the emirate of Sicily. The Lombard prince of Salerno, a man named Guaimar III, was cowering behind his walls, his treasury empty and his army demoralized, and he was on the verge of accepting the humiliating terms of surrender that the Muslim commander had dictated, terms that would have stripped the principality of its wealth and reduced its citizens to the status of permanent tributaries of the Islamic power. The Norman pilgrims, who were, despite their pious disguise, seasoned warriors, armed to the teeth and mounted on the finest war horses that the stud farms of Normandy could produce, were outraged by the spectacle of Christian submission to the infidel, and they demanded that Guaimar provide them with arms and armor from his own arsenal, so that they could sally forth and break the siege. The prince, who had nothing to lose and who was skeptical of the stranger's chances, agreed, and the following morning, the small band of Norman knights, perhaps no more than 40 in number, charged out of the city gates in a tight, disciplined wedge formation, their lances couched and their swords gleaming in the Mediterranean sun. And they fell upon the mass ranks of the Saracen besiegers with a fury that was unlike anything the Muslims had ever encountered. The shock of the Norman charge, which was a tactic that the Saracens, who were accustomed to the more fluid, skirmishing style of warfare that was prevalent in the Mediterranean, had no experience of countering, shattered the enemy line, and the Normans, riding down the fleeing, panic-stricken Muslims, inflicted a slaughter that was so complete and so terrifying that the survivors immediately abandoned their camp and fled to their ships, lifting the siege and delivering the city of Salerno from the brink of destruction. Prince Guaimar III, overwhelmed with gratitude and awed by the martial prowess of his deliverers, loaded them with rich gifts of gold, silver, and precious silks, and he begged them to remain in his service, offering them generous salaries and the promise of lands and titles if they would stay and defend his principality against its many enemies. The Norman knights, who had seen, with their own eyes, the extraordinary wealth and the profound political weakness of the Lombard south, were more than willing to accept the offer, and they sent word back to their homelands in Normandy, a message that was carried by the returning pilgrims and the traveling merchants, a message that described, in glowing, hyperbolic terms, a land of milk and honey, a land where a brave knight, with nothing but his sword and his horse, could win a fief that was larger and richer than anything that the cramped, overpopulated Duchy of Normandy could offer. This message, which was, in essence, the founding charter of the Norman migration to Italy, spread through the castles and the villages of the Cotentin and the Pays de Caux like wildfire, and it ignited a wave of emigration that would, over the following decades, transport thousands of landless knights, ambitious barons, and restless younger sons across the Alps and into the Mezzogiorno, a human tide that would, within a century, sweep away the old order and replace it with a new Norman order. A kingdom that was built, from the ground up, on the principles of feudal obligation, heavy cavalry dominance, and an extraordinary, pragmatic tolerance for the diverse, conquered peoples over whom they ruled. Among the thousands of Norman adventurers who answered the call of the South, the family that would rise to the pinnacle of power, surpassing all of its rivals and founding the dynasty that would rule the Kingdom of Sicily for over a century, was the Hauteville clan, the sons of a relatively obscure, but formidably prolific, minor baron named Tancred of Hauteville, a man whose very obscurity was, in the retrospective glow of his son's achievements, transformed into a symbol of the raw, unadorned, and divinely favored virtue of the Norman stock. The Hauteville fief, which was located in the region of the Cotentin Peninsula, in the modern department of Manche, was a small, unremarkable manor, a cluster of stone houses and a simple, wooden palisade that was far removed from the centers of ducal power in Rouen and Caen, and Tancred, who was a knight of modest means and limited political influence, could never have imagined, in his wildest dreams, that his loins would produce a brood of conquerors who would redraw the map of the Mediterranean and humble popes, emperors, and caliphs. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis, who is the primary source for the early Hauteville genealogy, records that Tancred was a man of exceptional physical strength and martial prowess, a warrior who had served the Dukes of Normandy with distinction in their endless border conflicts with the neighboring French counties, but he was also a man of a restless, roving eye, and his two successive marriages, first to Muriela, a woman of high birth but small dowry, and then, upon her death, to Frasenda, a woman of even more obscure origins, produced a total of no fewer than 12 sons and at least 3 daughters, a number that was, even by the standards of the prolific Norman nobility, remarkable and, for a minor baron with a single, modest fief, a recipe for dynastic disaster. The system of inheritance that prevailed in Normandy, which was based on the principle of primogeniture, dictated that the entirety of the Hauteville estate would pass, upon Tancred's death, to his eldest son, Serlo, who would, in his turn, be obliged to provide for his younger brothers from the limited revenues of a single, not very productive, manor. A situation that was clearly unsustainable and that ensured that the younger Hauteville sons would have to seek their fortunes far from the familiar, apple-scented orchards and the grey, stone churches of their native Cotentin. The 3 eldest sons, Serlo, Geoffrey, and William Iron-Arm, were the first to depart for Italy, arriving in the Mezzogiorno in the mid-1030s, where they attached themselves to the retinue of the established Norman mercenary leader, Rainulf Drengit, the Count of Aversa, who was, at that time, the most powerful Norman lord in the peninsula and who was in constant need of fresh, disciplined fighting men to prosecute his endless wars against the Lombard princes of Capua and the Byzantine garrisons of the coastal cities. William Iron-Arm, who would earn his evocative surname through his extraordinary feats of physical strength and his fearless, almost suicidal, charges into the thick of the enemy line, quickly distinguished himself as the most formidable warrior of the Hauteville brood, a man whose prowess in battle was so legendary that, according to the chronicler Amatus, he single-handedly killed the Saracen emir of Syracuse in a duel during the siege of that city, a feat of arms that was celebrated throughout the Norman camp and that elevated the prestige of the Hauteville name far above that of their more established, but less martial, rivals. The crucial turning point for the Hauteville family, however, and the moment that set the stage for their eventual, unparalleled dominance, was the decision of Tancred's eldest son by his second marriage, the young, brilliant, and utterly ruthless Robert, who would later be known to history, and to his trembling enemies, as Robert Guiscard, the Cunning, to abandon his impoverished, landless existence in Normandy and to seek his fortune, and his fief, in the crucible of the Italian South, a decision that would, within the span of a single, tumultuous lifetime, transform the bastard offshoot of a minor Norman baron into the most powerful secular ruler in the entire Mediterranean world. Robert of Hauteville, the 6th son of Tancred by his second wife Frasenda, was born in the year 1015, in the cramped stone manor house of Hauteville-la-Guichard, a man destined, by the cold, implacable calculus of primogeniture, to inherit nothing but his sword, his horse, and the fierce, unyielding ambition that burned in the hearts of all of Tancred's sons, and his early life, before his dramatic departure for the south, was a prolonged, humiliating apprenticeship in the brutal, uncompromising realities of a landless knight's existence in the 11th century. The sources, particularly the Deeds of Robert Guiscard. A panegyric biography written by the Norman chronicler William of Apulia in the 1090s, portrayed the young Robert as a figure of immense physical presence, a giant of a man with a shock of blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and shoulders so broad that, it was said, no doorframe could accommodate him, a physical description that is clearly intended to evoke the legendary heroes of the Norse sagas and to underline the direct genetic link between the new, Christian Norman conquerors and their pagan, Viking ancestors. Robert's character, as it emerges from the chronicles, was a complex, contradictory mixture of the most admired and the most feared traits of the Norman warrior-aristocrat, a profound, instinctive piety that was, nevertheless, entirely compatible with the most brutal and sacrilegious violence, a deep, feudal loyalty to his kin and his sworn lord that coexisted with a cold, calculating cunning that was capable of the most elaborate and successful deceptions, and a soaring, almost mystical belief in his own destiny that was tempered by a pragmatist eye for the main chance and a miser's obsession with the accumulation of land and treasure. His decision to leave Normandy, which was made in 1035, when he was 20 years old, was not the result of a specific, dramatic incident, but the culmination of years of simmering frustration and thwarted ambition, as he watched his elder brothers depart for the fabled, sun-drenched lands of the south, returning, after a few years, laden with gold and accompanied by the retinues of sworn men that were the essential markers of status in the Norman world. Robert gathered a small band of followers, 5 knights and 30 men-at-arms, all of them, like himself, landless, restless, and hungry for fortune, and he crossed the Alps, descending the steep, rocky passes of the Mont Cenis and the Great St. Bernard, following the ancient, Roman roads that led, through the rich, Lombard cities of the Po Valley, to the contested, war-torn frontier of the Cotentin, the Byzantine province of Apulia, where his brothers were already carving out their fiefs with the edge of the sword. The early years of Robert's Italian career, which lasted from his arrival in 1035 to his dramatic emergence as the most feared and the most powerful of the Norman leaders in the early 1050s, were a period of obscurity, hardship, and according to the later, embellished accounts, a series of adventures and escapades that were already legendary in his own lifetime, tales that were told with a mixture of admiration and horror, around the campfires of the Norman host. He began his service as a simple, undistinguished mercenary in the retinue of his elder brother William Iron Arm, who had, by this time, established himself as the dominant Norman warlord in the region of Melfi, the strategic, fortress-studded plateau that controlled the passes between the Byzantine coastal plain and the Lombard interior. But Robert's ambition was far too vast, and his personality far too domineering, to remain for long in the shadow of any man, even his own, celebrated brother. The rupture between the two siblings, which was recounted by the chroniclers as a classic, tragic tale of fraternal rivalry, occurred when William, in a distribution of the conquered Byzantine territories, granted Robert the tiny, impoverished castle of San Marco Argentano, a barren, mountain fastness in Calabria that was barely worth the upkeep. A calculated insult that was intended to remind the ambitious younger brother of his subordinate place in the Hautevilles hierarchy. Robert's response was a masterpiece of calculated, theatrical rage and strategic genius. He abandoned San Marco, withdrew to the remote, rugged Sila Massif, and embarked on a campaign of systematic banditry and extortion that was so successful, and so terrifying, that, within a few months, he had assembled a private army of over 200 knights and 1,000 infantry. A force that was larger than that of his brother and that made him, over the systematic Norman conquest of the Byzantine territories in southern Italy, which unfolded over the course of the 1040s and 1050s, was a military operation of breathtaking audacity and extraordinary effectiveness, a campaign that demonstrated, with every passing engagement, the overwhelming superiority of the Norman heavy cavalry over the demoralized, poorly led, and technologically outdated forces of the crumbling Cotentinate. The Byzantine Empire, which had, for over 5 centuries, been the undisputed master of the Italian south, was, by the middle of the 11th century, a shadow of its former, glorious self, its military resources stretched to the breaking point by the constant, existential pressure of the Seljuk Turk invasions in Anatolia, the Pecheneг raids across the Danube, and the simmering palace intrigues that paralyzed the central government in Constantinople. The Caetpans, the military governors who were dispatched from the imperial capital to rule the province, were, with a few notable exceptions, a succession of incompetent, corrupt, and short-sighted officials who viewed their Italian postings as little more than an opportunity to enrich themselves at the expense of the local population before being recalled to the safer, more lucrative environment of the court. The native Greek population of Apulia and Calabria, which had been subjected to centuries of heavy taxation, religious persecution by the Latin Rite Lombards, and the constant, grinding insecurity of the Saracen raids, was largely indifferent, and in many cases actively hostile, to the Byzantine administration, and they viewed the arrival of the Normans, with their strong, centralized leadership and their promise of a stable, orderly government, as a potential improvement over the chaotic, exploitative rule of the Caetpans. The Norman conquest was not a single, decisive campaign, but a slow, grinding process of siege and counter-siege, of raid and ambush, of negotiated surrenders and brutal, exemplary massacres, a process that was, in many ways, similar to the gradual, inexorable expansion of the Norman marches in Wales and Ireland, a relentless, generation-long pressure that the overstretched and demoralized Byzantine garrisons simply could not resist. The decisive battles of this period, the engagements that shattered the remaining Byzantine field armies and opened the gates of the coastal cities to the Norman knights, were a series of stunning, one-sided victories that demonstrated, in the most vivid and bloody terms imaginable, the tactical chasm that had opened up between the western and the eastern modes of warfare. The Battle of Cannae, which was fought in 1018, was the first, shocking demonstration of the Norman military superiority, but it was the Battle of Montepeloso in 1041, where a vastly outnumbered Norman army under the command of William Iron Arm and the Lombard prince Arduin annihilated a much larger Byzantine force, killing its commander, the Caetpan Michael Docianos, and capturing the imperial banner that truly signaled the beginning of the end of the Byzantine presence in Italy. The Normans, who had learned, in the hard, brutal school of the Frankish civil wars, the techniques of the coordinated heavy cavalry charge, the use of the couched lance as a shock weapon rather than a throwing spear, and the importance of the tight, disciplined formation, were facing a Byzantine army that was still organized, in its tactics and its equipment, along the lines that had been established in the 6th century. An army of infantry spearmen who were supported by a small, lightly armored cavalry force that was no match for the armored Norman knights. The fall of the great, fortified port cities of Apulia and Calabria, which had been the bastions of Byzantine power for centuries, was a slow, painful process that took nearly a generation, a series of epic sieges that tested the Norman military engineering skills and the endurance of their soldiers to the absolute limit, but one by one, the great ancient cities that had been founded by the Greek colonists and fortified by the Roman emperors, Reggio, the last Byzantine stronghold on the mainland, fell to the Guiscard in 1060, after a siege that had lasted for an entire year, a victory that effectively extinguished the Byzantine presence in the Italian peninsula and that made Robert the undisputed master of the entire, vast, and fabulously wealthy region of the Mezzogiorno, a territory that stretched from the Abruzzi Mountains to the sun-baked shores of the Ionian Sea. The dramatic, violent, and profoundly consequential confrontation between the Norman conquerors and the reformed, militant papacy, which reached its bloody climax on the field of Civitate in June of 1053, was a pivotal event in the history of the Italian peninsula, a battle that, in a single, brutal afternoon, reversed the tide of papal policy and transformed the Norman warlords from excommunicated bandits into the most favored and the most powerful allies of the Holy See, a transformation that would provide the essential, ideological and legal legitimacy for the creation of the Norman kingdom. The conflict was rooted in the profound, existential threat that the Norman expansion posed to the temporal and spiritual authority of the papacy, which, under the leadership of the great, reforming Pope Leo IX, had embarked on an ambitious, and ultimately doomed, campaign to purify the Church of the twin evils of simony and lay investiture, and to assert the supreme, universal jurisdiction of the successor of Saint Peter over all of the Christian princes of the West. The Norman territories, which had been carved out of the legitimate jurisdictions of the Lombard princes and the Byzantine emperors, were, in the eyes of the canon law, a single, vast, and ongoing act of theft and sacrilege, a cancer of lawless violence that was spreading across the patrimony of the Church and that had to be extirpated, by force if necessary, before it consumed the entire social order. Pope Leo IX, a German aristocrat of the House of Egesheim who had been appointed to the papal throne by his cousin, the Emperor Henry III, was a man of immense personal sanctity and unwavering moral courage, a reformer who had traveled extensively throughout his diocese of Toul in Lorraine, rooting out simony and enforcing clerical celibacy, and he was determined to apply the same uncompromising standards to the pacification of the southern Italian frontier. In the spring of 1053, Leo assembled a grand, anti-Norman coalition, an army that was composed of a contingent of heavy Swabian infantry, which had been provided by his imperial nephew, the Emperor Henry III, a force of Lombard levies from the Principality of Benevento, and a motley collection of volunteers from the Roman aristocracy, and he marched south, accompanied by the cardinals and the bishops of his curia, to confront the Norman host in a battle that he was confident would result, through the direct, divine intervention that he fervently prayed for, in the destruction of the pagan-like scourge. The Norman response to this existential threat was a model of strategic coordination and tactical brilliance, a demonstration of the Guiscard's ability to unite the fractious, competitive Norman barons under a single, centralized command in the face of a common danger. The Norman army, which numbered perhaps 3,000 knights and a slightly larger force of infantry, was, despite its numerical inferiority, a vastly more experienced and more cohesive fighting force than the papal coalition, its ranks filled with veterans who had spent their entire adult lives in the saddle, fighting the endless, grinding wars of the Mezzogiorno. The Battle of Civitate, which was fought on a hot, dusty plain near the Fortor River on June 18, 1053, was a shattering, one-sided victory for the Normans, a battle that began with a series of disciplined, probing attacks and that culminated, in the early afternoon, in a devastating, coordinated charge of the entire Norman cavalry force, which broke the Swabian infantry, the elite of the papal army, and sent the survivors fleeing, in wild, panic-stricken disorder, toward the walls of Civitate, where they were cut down, without mercy, by the pursuing Norman knights. Pope Leo IX, who had watched the destruction of his army from the ramparts of the city, was captured by the victorious Normans, and he was brought, in a state of profound, spiritual shock and physical exhaustion, before the very men whom he had, only hours before, declared to be the enemies of God and the Church. The subsequent treatment of the captive pope, which was orchestrated with immense political skill by Robert Guiscard and the other Norman leaders, was a masterpiece of calculated, psychological manipulation, a display of feigned piety and humble submission that completely disarmed the papal entourage and that laid the groundwork for the dramatic, and historically momentous, reconciliation that would follow. The Normans, rather than treating Leo as a prisoner, knelt before him, kissed his feet, and begged for his absolution and his blessing, a gesture of public, ostentatious humility that was entirely at odds with the reality of their overwhelming military victory, and which presented the Pope with an impossible, political dilemma. He could either accept their submission and grant them the legitimacy that they craved, or he could refuse, and remain, indefinitely, a captive of a band of excommunicated, and increasingly restive, warlords. The diplomatic and political revolution that followed the Battle of Civitate, which culminated in the Council of Melfi in 1059 and the signing of the historic Concordat that established the Norman duchy as a papal fief, was a stroke of genius that transformed Robert Guiscard from a successful, but still technically illegitimate, warlord into a divinely sanctioned prince, a vassal of the Holy See whose conquests were now, in the eyes of the canon law, legitimate and holy, a transformation that would provide the essential, legal and ideological foundation for the entire, subsequent history of the Norman kingdom. The death of Pope Leo IX in 1054, shortly after his release from Norman captivity, had thrown the papal court into a period of confusion and factional struggle, but the reforming party, which was now under the leadership of the formidable and visionary Cardinal Hildebrand, the future Pope Gregory VII, had drawn a profound and far-reaching lesson from the disaster at Civitate. The Normans, If they could be bound to the Holy See by the sacred ties of vassalage and the solemn oaths of feudal fealty, could be transformed from the most dangerous of enemies into the most powerful of allies, a secular sword that could be wielded by the Pope against the twin threats of the Holy Roman Emperor and the Greek schismatics. The negotiations that led to the Concordat of Melfi, which were conducted over a period of several years by a series of papal legates who traveled between the Norman camp and the Lateran palace, were a complex, delicate, and often tense process of mutual testing and bargaining. A diplomatic dance in which both sides sought to extract the maximum possible advantage from the other without triggering a renewed outbreak of hostilities. The Normans, who were, by this time, in the process of completing their conquest of the last Byzantine strongholds in Calabria and who were looking, with increasing, predatory attention, at the rich, Muslim-held island of Sicily, needed the papal imprimatur to legitimize their existing conquests and to provide a religious justification for their future, ambitious campaigns, a justification that would, in the context of the nascent crusading movement, be of immense political and recruitment value. The papacy, for its part, needed the Norman heavy cavalry to counter the constant, threatening pressure of the German emperors, who, under the Salian dynasty, were asserting their right to appoint the bishops and the popes themselves, and to enforce the claims of the Roman Church to jurisdiction over the Greek churches of the south, which had been, for centuries, loyal to the Patriarch of Constantinople and which were now, under Norman rule, being forcibly subjected to the Latin Rite and the papal supremacy. The Concordat of Melfi, which was formally signed in the summer of 1059 in the great, fortified castle that was the Norman capital, was a triumph of mutual, pragmatic accommodation. Robert Guiscard, kneeling before Pope Nicholas II, swore a solemn oath of fealty, an oath that was carefully drafted to balance the recognition of the papal suzerainty with the preservation of the Duke's practical, political autonomy, and in return, the Pope invested him with the titles of Duke of Apulia and Calabria, and by the grace of God and St. Peter, future Duke of Sicily. A formula that was, in its ingenious ambiguity, a blanket endorsement of all of the Norman conquests past, present, and future, and a declaration, to the entire Christian world, that the war against the Muslims of Sicily was not a mere land grab, but a holy, papal-sanctioned crusade. The political and psychological impact of the Concordat was immediate and immense. The Norman barons, who had previously been a loose, fractious coalition of independent warlords, were now bound, by the sacred oaths of feudal law, to a single, legitimate duke, a sovereign who could, in the name of the Pope, enforce discipline, levy taxes, and demand military service, a transformation that laid the foundations for the centralized, bureaucratic state that the Normans would, in the following century, construct. The Byzantine Empire, which had, until this moment, maintained the fading hope of reconquering its lost Italian provinces, was now confronted with a Norman enemy who was not merely a band of lawless adventurers, but a legitimate, papal-sanctioned prince, a status that would have profound, and disastrous, consequences for the future of the empire in the Balkans and the Levant. The final, decisive act in the Norman conquest of the Byzantine territories on the Italian mainland was the epic, prolonged, and extraordinarily brutal siege of Bari, the great, ancient port city that had been, for over 5 centuries, the capital of the Byzantine presence in the west, the seat of the Cape-Pans, and the most important commercial and military center on the entire Adriatic coast. A city whose fall, in April of 1071, after a siege that had lasted for nearly 3 years, sent a shockwave through the entire Christian world and signaled, in the most vivid and unambiguous terms imaginable, the definitive end of the Roman Empire in Italy. The city of Bari, which was situated on a narrow, easily defensible peninsula that jutted out into the azure, fish-rich waters of the Adriatic, was one of the most heavily fortified urban centers in the entire Mediterranean. Its walls, which had been originally constructed by the Roman emperors and which had been continuously strengthened and expanded by the Byzantine military engineers, were a formidable circuit of stone and brick, punctuated by massive, projecting towers and protected, on the seaward side, by a powerful chain that could be stretched across the harbor mouth to prevent the entry of any hostile fleet. The garrison of the city, which was commanded by the last, and one of the ablest, of the Byzantine Pans, a general named Hautevilles, was composed of a corps of professional soldiers, including a contingent of the elite Varangian Guard, the axe-wielding, Scandinavian mercenaries who had been the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperors for over a century, and a larger, but less reliable, militia of the local Greek citizens, who were, despite their long-standing loyalty to the empire, deeply weary of the endless, grinding war and who were beginning to despair of the possibility of any effective relief from the distant, distracted court of Constantinople. The siege of Bari, which began in the summer of 1068, was the most complex and the most challenging military operation that Robert Guiscard had ever undertaken, a test of his logistical genius, his engineering skills, and his sheer, implacable patience that stretched the resources of his newly consolidated duchy to their absolute limits. The Guiscard, who had learned, from his study of the classical military manuals that were available in the Norman court, the techniques of the ancient Roman siege craft, constructed a line of circumvallation around the entire landward side of the city, a vast earthen rampart that was topped with a wooden palisade and that was studded, at regular intervals, with fortified towers. A barrier that was designed to prevent any sortie by the garrison and to cut off all communication and supply between the city and the surrounding countryside. The naval blockade of the city, which was the essential, indispensable component of the siege, was a far more difficult and a far more costly undertaking, as the Byzantine fleet, which was still, despite its long decline, a formidable naval power, was able to run the Norman blockade on several occasions, delivering vital shipments of grain, weapons, and reinforcements to the beleaguered garrison and keeping the hope of survival, and of eventual imperial relief, flickering in the hearts of the defenders. The turning point in the siege, the event that finally broke the morale of the Bariates and sealed the fate of the city, was the arrival, in the spring of 1071, of a massive, new Norman fleet, a fleet that the Guiscard had constructed, at immense expense, in the newly conquered ports of Calabria, and that was crewed by a mixture of Norman knights, Lombard sailors, and most importantly, a contingent of Sicilian Saracen mercenaries, whose knowledge of the local waters and whose skill in naval warfare was an invaluable, and deeply ironic, addition to the Christian host. The final assault on the harbor chain, which was carried out on a night of the full moon in April 1071, was a masterpiece of combined arms coordination. The Norman warships, their prows reinforced with iron and their decks packed with heavily armed knights, smashing through the chain in a series of coordinated, ramming attacks, while the Guiscard, leading the land assault in person, stormed the seaward walls with the force of his most trusted Huscarls, the elite, household troops who were the core of the Norman army. The fall of Bari, which occurred on April 16, 1071, was the final, inevitable capitulation of a garrison that had been reduced to the brink of starvation and that had, in the end, been abandoned by the distant, indifferent emperor in Constantinople, a surrender that was conducted with the full, ceremonial honors of war and that marked the definitive, irrevocable end of the 500-year history of the Roman Empire in the Italian peninsula, a moment that was, for the Normans, the ultimate vindication of their decades-long campaign, and for the Byzantines, a bitter, humiliating coda to the long, slow death of their western dominion. With the Byzantine power in Italy crushed and the mainland securely under his iron-fisted control, Robert Guiscard, the ever-ambitious, ever-calculating duke, now turned his predatory gaze toward the ultimate prize of the central Mediterranean, the vast, fertile, and fabulously wealthy island of Sicily, a land of towering, snow-capped volcanoes, golden, sun-drenched wheat fields, and ancient, cosmopolitan cities that had been, since the early 9th century, the domain of the Muslim emirs, a land that the papacy had, in the Concordat of Melfi, already granted to the Guiscard in a solemn, prophetic investiture that now demanded to be fulfilled. The island of Sicily, which lies at the very center of the Mediterranean, separated from the Italian mainland by the narrow, treacherous waters of the Strait of Messina, was, in the mid-11th century, a political entity that was, in its own way, as fragmented and as unstable as the Mezzogiorno had been before the Norman arrival. A land of profound cultural and religious divisions that had been torn apart, for decades, by a brutal, internecine civil war between the rival emirs of the Chalbid dynasty, the ruling family that had governed the island for over a century, and by the simmering, resentful hostility between the ruling Sunni Arab elite, the Berber tribesmen of the interior, and the large, Greek-speaking, Christian population that still constituted the majority of the island's inhabitants, particularly in the eastern, mountainous region of the Val d'Amone. The emirate of Sicily, which had been founded by the Aghlabid invaders from Africa in the early 9th century, had reached the apogee of its power and its cultural brilliance in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, a period that had seen the construction of the great, glittering palaces of Palermo, the cultivation of the exquisite, terraced gardens that surrounded the capital, and the flourishing of a rich, syncretic Arab-Islamic civilization that had made the island the most economically advanced and the most intellectually sophisticated region in all of Western Europe. The internal collapse of this brilliant, but fragile, political order, which had been triggered by the death of the last, strong Chalbid emir, al-Hassan al-Samit, in 1052, had plunged the island into a chaos of warring factions, a desperate, three-sided struggle for power between the three rival emirs who had carved out their independent principalities in the cities of Palermo, Agrigento, and Syracuse. A conflict that had devastated the countryside, paralyzed the economy, and created a power vacuum that the Normans, with their disciplined, hungry, and papally sanctioned army, were uniquely well positioned to exploit. The first, tentative Norman incursion onto the island, which was led not by the Guiscard himself, who was preoccupied with the final, grinding stages of the siege of Bari, but by his youngest, and most brilliant, brother, Roger Bosso, who would, in the fullness of time, eclipse even his famous sibling as the true, founding father of the Sicilian kingdom, was a small, almost private, military adventure. A raid that was organized, in the spring of 1061, at the invitation of a local, Muslim faction, the Emir of Cotentin, who was locked in a desperate struggle with his rival, the Emir of Palermo, and who, in a moment of fatal, short-sighted calculation, had sought the assistance of the Norman knights, whom he had observed, from across the strait, annihilating the Byzantine armies of the mainland. The landing of Roger and his small force of knights on the beaches of Messina, which was executed with the characteristic, lightning speed and tactical surprise of the Norman amphibious assault, was the opening act of a conquest that would, over the next 3 decades, result in the complete, systematic subjugation of the entire island, a process that was as much a war of attrition, of siege and counter-siege, of raid and ambush, as it was a war of set-piece battles, a grinding, relentless campaign that tested the endurance, the courage, and the sheer, stubborn tenacity of the Norman conquerors to their absolute limits. The early phase of the Sicilian War, the capture of Messina and the subsequent, hard-fought advance along the northern coast toward the great, walled capital of Palermo, was a series of desperate, closely fought engagements against a Muslim enemy that, despite its internal divisions, was a formidable, well-equipped, and fanatically determined defender of its homeland, an enemy that possessed, in its fleet of fast, lateen-rigged galleys, a naval dominance that allowed it to contest the control of the sea and to resupply its besieged garrisons, a challenge that the Normans, who were, in their origins, a land-based power, were only slowly, and at great cost, learning to counter. The siege and capture of Palermo, the great, glittering, and densely populated Muslim capital of Sicily, in January of 1072, was the decisive strategic turning point of the entire Norman conquest of the island, a military operation of epic scale and immense complexity that demonstrated, for the first time in the history of the Norman expansion, the full combined arms capability of the Christian forces, and that resulted in the fall of one of the largest, the wealthiest, and the most culturally significant cities in the entire Mediterranean world. The city of Palermo, which the Arabs called Balarm, was, in the 11th century, a sprawling, magnificent metropolis of perhaps 200,000 souls, a city whose population exceeded that of any Christian city in Western Europe, including Rome, and whose wealth, derived from its strategic position at the crossroads of the African, the Italian, and the Levantine trade routes, was legendary throughout the Islamic and the Christian worlds. The defenses of the city were as formidable as its wealth was proverbial, a complex, layered system of fortifications that had been constructed, over the centuries, by the Aghlabid and the Kalbid emirs, and that included a massive, crenellated circuit wall that enclosed the entire, teardrop-shaped peninsula on which the old city was built, a series of deep, stone-lined moats that protected the landward approaches, and a heavily fortified citadel, the Khazar, which was the residence of the emir and the administrative center of the entire island. The Norman army that assembled before the walls of Palermo in the late summer of 1071 was the largest and the most powerful force that the Hautevilles brothers had ever commanded, a host of perhaps 5,000 knights and 15,000 infantry, a multi-ethnic, multilingual army that included Norman and French heavy cavalry, Lombard and Greek levies from the mainland, and, in a remarkable, pragmatic display of the Normans' willingness to employ any tool that served their purpose, a contingent of Sicilian Saracen mercenaries who had defected to the Christian side in exchange for the promise of land and the protection of their religion. The siege, which lasted for 5 grueling months, from August of 1071 to January of 1072, was a combined land and sea operation, a test of the Norman logistical system and their engineering skills that was, in many ways, even more demanding than the epic siege of Bari that had been concluded only a few months earlier. The Guiscard, who had finally arrived on the island to take personal command of the operation, established a tight, disciplined blockade of the city on the landward side, constructing a line of circumvallation and launching a series of probing attacks against the walls, while Roger, who was the master of the cavalry raids, devastated the surrounding countryside, the Concadoro, the Golden Shell, the fertile, irrigated plain that was the breadbasket of the capital, destroying the orchards, burning the grain stores, and cutting off the city's supply of food. The decisive factor in the fall of Palermo, however, was the naval blockade, a massive, coordinated operation that was conducted by a fleet of over 100 Norman and Allied vessels, which had been constructed in the newly conquered ports of Calabria and which were now commanded by a Norman admiral, a man named Christodolos, a Greek convert to the Latin Rite who had placed his intimate knowledge of the Sicilian waters and the Saracen naval tactics at the service of the Guiscard. The Norman fleet, which had, in a series of sharp, bloody engagements, driven the Saracen galleys back into the harbor, now sealed the entrance of the port, a narrow, easily defensible channel that was protected by a massive, iron chain, and on the night of January 5, 1072, a squadron of Norman shock troops, led by Roger in person, launched a daring, amphibious assault on the seaward walls, scaling the fortifications with grappling hooks and ladders, and opening a gate through which the main body of the Christian army poured into the heart of the city. The sack of Palermo, which unfolded over the following days, was a relatively restrained, controlled operation by the brutal standards of the period, a deliberate, calculated decision by the Guiscard to preserve the economic infrastructure and the human capital of the city, which he intended to make the capital of his new, Mediterranean empire, rather than to destroy it in an orgy of mindless destruction. The Muslim population, which was granted the protection of their lives, their property, and crucially, their right to worship freely in their mosques, was allowed to remain in the city, a concession that was, in its time, an extraordinary act of pragmatic tolerance, and one that laid the foundation for the multicultural, multi-religious character of the Norman kingdom that would, within a few decades, emerge from the chaos of the conquest. The relentless, world-spanning ambition of Robert Guiscard, which had already conquered the Mezzogiorno and captured the capital of Muslim Sicily, was not, by any stretch of the imagination, sated by these extraordinary, unprecedented achievements. And in the spring of 1081, the Duke, who was now in his mid-60s but still possessed the physical vigor and the restless, predatory energy of a man half his age, launched the most audacious, the most dangerous, and ultimately, the most tragic of all his campaigns, a full-scale, amphibious invasion of the Byzantine Empire, a direct assault on the very heart of the ancient, still great power that he had expelled from Italy, an enterprise that would bring the Norman army to the walls of Constantinople itself and that would, in its epic, tragic failure, demonstrate the absolute limits of even the Guiscard's extraordinary will. The strategic objectives of the Balkan campaign were, in their scope and their audacity, a direct challenge to the entire, established order of the Christian world, a plan that, if successful, would have resulted in the Norman conquest of the Byzantine Empire and the establishment of a vast, Norman-dominated state that stretched from the Pillars of Hercules to the Hellespont. A realm that would have been the most powerful political entity in the entire Mediterranean basin. The Guiscards' immediate, public justification for the invasion was the restoration of the deposed Byzantine Emperor, Michael VII Doukas, whose son, Constantine, had been betrothed to one of the Guiscards' own daughters, a dynastic alliance that provided a thin, but useful, veneer of legitimacy for the naked, predatory ambition that was the true, driving force of the campaign. The Norman army that was assembled at the port of Otranto, on the heel of the Italian boot, in the spring of 1081, was the most powerful and the most heterogeneous force that the Guiscards had ever commanded, a host of perhaps 15,000 men, including the elite of the Norman heavy cavalry, the iron core of the army, a contingent of Lombard and Greek infantry, a large, unpredictable force of Sicilian Saracen mercenaries, and most critically, a powerful fleet of over 150 warships, which was essential for the transport and the supply of the invasion force across the treacherous, storm-tossed waters of the Adriatic Sea. The target of the invasion was the great, fortified port city of Dyrrhachium, the modern Durrës in Albania, which was the western terminus of the Via Egnatia, the ancient, Roman military road that ran, straight as an arrow, across the mountains of Macedonia and Thrace, to the very walls of Constantinople itself. A strategic choke point whose capture would open the road to the imperial capital and would sever the vital, overland communication link between the Byzantine heartland and its remaining Western European possessions. The Siege of Dyrrhachium, which began in June of 1081 and lasted for over 4 months, was a military operation of staggering scale and intensity, a confrontation between the most formidable army in the Latin West and the still formidable, if diminished, military machine of the Byzantine Empire, which was now commanded by the brilliant, young, and utterly ruthless emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, the founder of the dynasty that would rule the empire for over a century, and the man who would prove to be the Guiscards' most worthy, and most implacable, adversary. The battle for the city was not a single, decisive engagement, but a protracted, grinding campaign of siege and counter-siege, of naval skirmishes in the narrow, rocky channel that separated the Norman camp from the island of Corfu, and of desperate, bloody assaults on the massive, cyclopean walls that had been constructed by the Roman emperors and that had never, in all of their long history, been breached by a hostile force. The climax of the siege, the great, pitched battle that was fought on October 18, 1081, under the shadow of the city walls, was a direct, head-on collision between the Norman heavy cavalry, led by the Guiscards in person, and the elite of the Byzantine army, including the fearsome Varangian Guard, the axe-wielding, Scandinavian warriors who had been the personal, imperial bodyguard for over a century. A battle that was, by the account of Anna Komnene, the emperor's daughter and the greatest historian of the age, the most terrible and the most bloody engagement that had been fought in living memory, a slaughter that left the field covered, for a mile in every direction, with the bodies of the fallen, the Norman and the Byzantine dead lying, in a terrible, intimate embrace, where they had fallen. The initial, stunning Norman victory at the Battle of Dyrrhachium, which saw the Varangian Guard annihilated and the Byzantine army routed, opened the road to Constantinople, but the subsequent, grinding campaign across the mountains of Macedonia and Thrace proved to be the Guiscards' undoing, a long, bitter winter of disease, desertion, and the constant harassing attacks of the Pecheneg and the Turkish mercenaries that Alexios had, with his characteristic, diplomatic genius, recruited to his cause, a campaign that slowly, inexorably, bled the Norman army white and that forced the Guiscards, for the first time in his long, victorious career, to retreat. The decision to withdraw from the Balkans, which was made in the spring of 1082, was not a confession of defeat, but a strategic, temporary withdrawal, a recognition that the overextended Norman supply lines, which stretched, dangerously and precariously, back across the Adriatic, could not sustain the army through another campaign season, and that the Guiscards must return to Italy, to crush the dangerous Byzantine-sponsored revolt that had erupted in his rear, before he could resume his march on the imperial capital. The revolt, which had been instigated by the gold and the promises of Alexios Komnenos, was led by a coalition of the Guiscard's most powerful and most resentful Norman and Lombard vassals, who had chafed, for years, under the Duke's iron-fisted, centralized rule, and who now saw, in his absence and his apparent, temporary weakness, the opportunity to throw off the Hautevilles yoke and to carve out their own independent principalities. The Guiscard's response to this existential, internal threat was a display of the same implacable fury and the same tactical brilliance that had won him his duchy, a whirlwind campaign of fire and sword that swept through the rebel-held territories, storming the castles, executing the leaders, and restoring, with a brutality that shocked even the hardened Norman chroniclers, the absolute, unquestioned authority of the ducal power. The suppression of the revolt, which was completed by the end of 1082, was a necessary, but costly, diversion of resources and energy, and it delayed, by over a year, the resumption of the Balkan campaign, a delay that allowed the wily, resourceful Alexios to rebuild his shattered army, to recruit new regiments of Frankish and Turkish mercenaries, and to prepare a new, and far more effective, defensive strategy for the protection of his capital. The Guiscard, who was now in his late 60s, his body ravaged by the decades of constant campaigning, but his will still unbroken and his ambition still burning with the fierce, undimmed fire of his youth, returned to the Balkans in the autumn of 1084, at the head of a new, powerful army, determined to complete the conquest that he had, 3 years earlier, been forced to abandon. The final, tragic act of the Guiscard's extraordinary life was played out on the island of Cephalonia, in the Ionian Sea, where the Norman fleet, which was the essential, indispensable instrument of his strategic vision, was devastated by a combination of a violent, autumnal storm and a sudden, devastating outbreak of a virulent, epidemic disease, a plague that swept through the crowded, unsanitary ships and the camps of the army, killing thousands of the veteran, irreplaceable soldiers and on July 17, 1085, claiming the life of the Guiscard himself, the great, terrible, and indomitable founder of the Norman state, who died, as he had lived, on a war footing, his eyes fixed, to the very end, on the distant, glittering, and ultimately unattainable goal of the imperial diadem of Constantinople. The death of Robert Guiscard, which was as sudden and as dramatic as his entire, meteoric career, plunged the Norman duchy into a period of chaos, confusion, and bitter, fratricidal conflict, a succession crisis that pitted the Guiscard's eldest son, the half-Lombard Bohemond, a brilliant, charismatic warrior who had inherited his father's martial prowess and his burning, insatiable ambition, against his younger, legitimate half-brother, Roger Borsa, who had been designated, in the Guiscard's will, as the heir to the Duchy of Apulia and Calabria, a division that would, for over a generation, tear the mainland Norman state apart. The Italian peninsula, which had, under the Guiscard's iron-fisted rule, been consolidated into a single, centrally directed, and terrifyingly effective military and political entity, now dissolved, with startling speed, into its old, familiar pattern of warring, independent baronies, a chaotic, blood-soaked landscape of siege and counter-siege, of treachery and broken oaths, a state of permanent, low-intensity civil war that consumed the energies of the Norman nobility, and that prevented any possibility of a renewed, large-scale expansion into the Balkans or the Levant. The true heir to the Guiscard's legacy, however, the man who would complete the conquest of Sicily, establish the foundations of the most brilliant and the most tolerant kingdom of the medieval world, and secure the lasting, historical immortality of the Hautevilles name, was not either of the warring, mainland brothers, but the youngest, and the most quietly competent, of the Guiscard's siblings, Roger Boso, the great Count of Sicily, a man whose patient, methodical, and politically astute style of leadership was the polar opposite of his famous, thunderous brother, and whose achievements, in the long, historical perspective, would prove to be even more enduring and more significant. Roger Boso, who had been the junior partner in the initial, daring invasion of Sicily in 1061, and who had, through decades of grinding, unglamorous warfare, gradually extended the Norman control over the entire, rugged, mountainous interior of the island, was a ruler of a very different stamp from the Guiscard. He was not a man of grand, sweeping, theatrical gestures. He was a builder, an administrator, a consolidator, a prince who understood that the conquest of a land was only the first, and the easiest, stage of its permanent acquisition, and that the true, lasting work of state building was the slow, patient, and often tedious labor of constructing the institutions, the laws, and the social contracts that would bind the conquered peoples to their new, Norman rulers. The foundation of Roger's success in Sicily, and the secret of the extraordinary, cultural brilliance that would, within a generation, flower under his son, Roger II, was his deliberate, pragmatic policy of religious and cultural tolerance, a policy that was not, in its essence, a matter of high-minded, liberal principle, but a cold, hard-headed recognition of the fundamental, demographic and political realities of the island that he had conquered. The population of Sicily, at the end of the 11th century, was a complex, layered mosaic of Greek-speaking, Orthodox Christians, who formed the majority in the eastern, mountainous Val d'Amon, a large, still dominant community of Arabic-speaking, Sunni Muslims, who were concentrated in the great, coastal cities and the fertile, agricultural plains of the west, and a small, but growing, Latin Rite Christian minority, composed of the Norman and Lombard settlers, the clergy, and the officials of the new, ruling elite. The attempt to forcibly convert, or to expel, the Muslim and the Greek populations, which was the policy that the more fanatical, and less pragmatic, of the Norman barons constantly advocated, would have been a demographic and an economic catastrophe, a recipe for permanent guerrilla warfare that would have destroyed the agricultural wealth and the commercial networks that were the very basis of the island's prosperity. Roger, who had learned, from his long, intimate experience of the Sicilian realities, the absolute necessity of accommodating the diverse, conquered communities, established a system of governance that was, in its time, a model of enlightened, pragmatic despotism, a regime in which the Muslim emirs, the Greek archons, and the Latin barons were all, in their respective spheres of influence, granted a substantial degree of autonomy, in return for their absolute, political loyalty, and the regular, punctual payment of their taxes, a system that would, under the guiding hand of his son, evolve into the magnificent, multicultural administration that was the glory of the Norman kingdom. The apotheosis of the Norman experiment in Sicily, the moment when the disparate, pragmatic policies of the great count were forged by the genius and the ambition of his son, into a single, magnificent, and unprecedented state, was the creation of the Kingdom of Sicily, a formal, internationally recognized monarchy that was proclaimed, with the full, solemn blessing of the papacy. On Christmas Day of the year 1130, in the great, glittering Cathedral of Palermo, an event that marked the culmination of over a century of Norman migration, conquest, and state building, and that signaled the birth of one of the most brilliant, the most powerful, and the most culturally sophisticated courts in the entire medieval world. The architect of this final, grand transformation was Roger II, the son of Roger Bosso and an Italian noblewoman, Adelaide del Vasto, a man who had inherited, from his father, the patient, methodical administrative genius, and from his mother, the deep, intimate connections to the complex, faction-ridden politics of the northern Italian communes, a ruler who combined, in his single, remarkable person, the ferocious, martial prowess of his Viking ancestors, the shrewd, calculating diplomacy of the Byzantine Basilius, and the refined, cosmopolitan cultural tastes of the Fatimid caliphs of Cairo, a synthesis that was, in itself, a living, breathing embodiment of the kingdom he created. The political context of the royal coronation was a decade of intense, complex, and often violent, maneuvering, a period in which Roger II, who had succeeded, in 1105, to the county of Sicily at the age of 10, and who had, over the subsequent 25 years, consolidated his control over the island and the mainland Norman territories, exploited a deep, bitter schism within the papal curia, the Anacletan schism, to extract, from the desperate, rival Pope Anacletus II, the grant of a royal crown that his predecessors had, for decades, been seeking. The coronation ceremony, which was conducted with a deliberate, calculated magnificence that was designed to overawe the Norman barons and to impress the foreign ambassadors who had gathered in Palermo, was a stunning, visual manifesto of the new kingdom's unique cultural synthesis, a liturgy that blended the Latin rite of the Roman Church with the elaborate, hieratic ceremonial of the Byzantine court. And that was performed, under the golden, shimmering mosaics of the cathedral, by a clergy that included both Latin bishops and Greek archimandrites, a vivid, public demonstration of the multicultural, multilingual character of the Hautevilles state. The kingdom that Roger II ruled, from his magnificent, sun-drenched capital of Palermo, was a realm of staggering, bewildering diversity, a state in which the official documents were issued simultaneously, in Latin, Greek, and Arabic, a trilingual administration that was, in itself, a symbol of the kingdom's role as a bridge between the three great civilizations of the medieval Mediterranean. The royal court, which was housed in the great, sprawling complex of palaces that the Norman kings constructed on the ruins of the Calbid emirate, was a magnet for the scholars, the artists, the geographers, and the scientists of the entire known world, a place where the great Arab geographer al-Idrisi, under the patronage of Roger II, compiled the most accurate and the most comprehensive map of the world that had been produced since the classical age, a work of science and scholarship that was, in its time, without parallel in the Latin West. The legacy of Roger II, and of the Norman kingdom that he founded, is not merely a matter of the stunning, breathtaking monuments that still survive, the great, golden mosaics of the Palatine Chapel and the Cathedral of Cefalù, the architectural fusion of the Romanesque, the Byzantine, and the Islamic styles that is, to this day, the visual signature of the Norman Sicilian civilization. The royal coronation of Roger II in the Cathedral of Palermo on Christmas Day of the year 1130 was not merely a ceremonial flourish, a glittering spectacle of silks and incense, and golden mosaics designed to dazzle the assembled nobility of the newly minted kingdom. It was a profound, deliberate, and carefully calculated act of political statecraft. A declaration to the entire Mediterranean world that the Norman dominion in the south had ceased to be a loose, opportunistic collection of fiefs, and had become, in the eyes of God and the Holy Roman Church, a legitimate, sovereign, and divinely ordained monarchy, a kingdom that claimed, by right of conquest and by the grace of the Apostolic See, a status that was equal, in dignity and in authority, to the great, established crowns of Christendom. The coronation itself, which was conducted according to a ritual that had been meticulously designed by the king's closest advisors, blending the Latin rites of the Roman pontifical with the elaborate, hieratic ceremonial of the Byzantine imperial court, was a masterful piece of political theater, a visual and auditory manifesto of the new state's unique, multicultural identity. The king, clad in a dalmatic of shimmering, gold-embroidered silk that had been woven in the royal workshops of Palermo, with a crown that was a fusion of the Byzantine camelochian and the Western, jeweled circlet, was anointed with the holy chrism by the Archbishop of Palermo, a prelate who was, in a deliberate, symbolic gesture, of Greek origin, a man named Peter, who had been chosen by Roger II precisely because his ethnicity and his rite represented the bridge between the Latin and the Orthodox communities that the king was determined to unite under his scepter. The cathedral itself, which had been, until the Norman conquest, the great, congregational mosque of the Muslim emirs, and which still bore, in its architectural fabric, the traces of its Islamic past, was a powerful, silent witness to the extraordinary transformation that had taken place on the island, a physical embodiment of the layered, contested, and ultimately synthesized history that the new kingdom claimed as its heritage. The coronation mass, which was chanted in both Latin and Greek, with the epistle and the gospel being proclaimed in both languages, was a public, liturgical enactment of the cultural dualism that was the cornerstone of Roger's state-building project, a demonstration, to the assembled Latin barons, Greek archons, and Saracen emirs, that the new king was not merely a Norman warlord who had imposed his rule by the sword, but a universal sovereign who stood above, and who guaranteed the rights and the customs of all of the diverse, conquered peoples of his realm. The political reaction to the coronation, beyond the borders of the kingdom, was immediate, hostile, and, in the short term, deeply threatening to the stability of the new monarchy. The Pope in Rome, Innocent II, who had been the rival of Anacletus II and who had, after a long, bitter schism, emerged as the universally recognized pontiff, refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of Roger's royal title, which had been granted, in his eyes, by a discredited antipope, and he excommunicated the Sicilian king, declaring him a usurper and a schismatic, and calling upon the Christian princes of Europe to join a holy war against the Norman upstart. The Holy Roman Emperor, Lothair III, who was the secular protector of the papacy and who viewed the creation of a powerful, independent Norman kingdom on the southern flank of his empire as a direct, strategic threat, eagerly responded to the papal call, and in the summer of 1136, a massive, imperial army, reinforced by the troops of the rebellious Norman barons of the mainland, who had seized the opportunity of the papal imperial offensive to throw off the yoke of Palermo, marched into the Mezzogiorno, determined to crush the nascent kingdom before it could consolidate its power. The crisis of the imperial invasion, which swept through Apulia and Campania with devastating speed, capturing the great, fortified cities of Salerno and Bari, was the most severe test that the young kingdom had ever faced, a moment of existential peril that would have destroyed a lesser ruler. But Roger II, who had inherited the iron will and the strategic cunning of his Hautevilles ancestors, responded with a combination of patience, diplomacy, and, when the moment was ripe, devastating military force, a strategy that would, within a few years, completely reverse the fortunes of the war and secure the permanent, unchallenged independence of the Sicilian crown. The death of Lothair III in December 1137, which occurred as he was retreating across the Alps after a grueling, inconclusive campaign, was the turning point of the conflict, a stroke of fortune that Roger II, who was, in all things, a master of timing and opportunity, exploited with breathtaking speed and ruthlessness, launching a sweeping, lightning offensive that recaptured the lost cities, crushed the rebellious barons, and by the end of 1139, forced the humiliated Pope Innocent II, who had been captured in a skirmish near the river Garigliano, to grant, in the Treaty of Mignano, the full, unconditional recognition of the royal title and the sovereign independence of the Kingdom of Sicily, a diplomatic triumph that was sealed, with a grim, symbolic finality, by the ceremonial execution of the most prominent of the rebel barons, their heads displayed on the battlements of the Castel dell'Ovo as a permanent warning to any who would challenge the authority of the Hautevilles crown. The internal administration of the Kingdom of Sicily, which was constructed, in a remarkably short period of time, by Roger II and his most brilliant and trusted ministers, was a bureaucratic and fiscal machine of extraordinary sophistication and efficiency, a system of government that was, in its complexity and its centralization, without parallel in the contemporary Latin West. And that represented a deliberate, conscious fusion of the administrative traditions of the Norman feudal monarchy, the Byzantine imperial bureaucracy, and the Islamic fiscal system of the Fatimid Caliphate, a synthesis that was the unique, defining characteristic of the Hautevilles state. The central organ of this administrative system was the Royal Diwan, a term that was borrowed directly from the Arabic Diwan, the council or the register, an institution that was housed in the great, sprawling complex of the Royal Palace in Palermo, and that was staffed by a multi-ethnic, multilingual corps of trained, professional bureaucrats, who were known, in the Latin documents, as the Secretarii, or the Magistri, and who were responsible for the collection of the taxes, the management of the royal domain, the recruitment and the payment of the army and the navy, and the dispensation of the royal justice, a concentration of fiscal and judicial authority that was, in its scope and its efficiency, far in advance of the rudimentary, fragmented administrations of the feudal kingdoms of France and England. The fiscal system of the kingdom was the most advanced and the most productive in all of Christendom, a complex, graduated structure of land taxes, customs duties, and state monopolies that was based, in its fundamental principles, on the Islamic tax registers that the Normans had inherited from the Kalbid emirs, and that was administered, in its daily operations, by a corps of Arabic-speaking, Greek, and Jewish officials who maintained the records in the three official languages of the kingdom. A trilingual bureaucracy that was, in itself, a testament to the pragmatic, inclusive genius of the Norman approach to governance. The land tax, which was the primary source of the kingdom's immense revenue, was assessed, not according to the arbitrary, customary obligations of the feudal system, but on the basis of a comprehensive, periodically updated cadastral survey, the Jarida, an Arabic term that referred to the detailed, written record of every plot of land, its size, its soil quality, the crops it produced, and the number and the status of the peasants who worked it, a system of centralized, rational assessment that allowed the royal treasury to extract a consistent, predictable surplus from the agricultural wealth of the kingdom, and that prevented the kind of feudal tax evasion and fragmentation that was the chronic weakness of the northern monarchies. The royal monopolies, which were another innovation that was borrowed from the Islamic State, gave the crown a direct, controlling interest in the most lucrative sectors of the Sicilian economy, including the production and the export of grain, the staple crop of the island and the source of its legendary wealth, the salt pans of the western coast, the silk workshops of Palermo, and the tuna fisheries of the Tyrrhenian. A portfolio of state-owned enterprises that generated a vast, steady flow of gold into the royal coffers and that made the Norman king, by far, the wealthiest monarch in the Latin West, a financial power that was the essential, underlying foundation of his military and his diplomatic strength. The administration of justice, which was the third pillar of the royal bureaucracy, was conducted through a hierarchy of royal courts that were presided over by the justiciars, professional, legally trained judges who were appointed directly by the king and who were responsible for enforcing the corpus of the royal law, a body of legislation that had been codified, by order of Roger II, in the Assizes of Ariano, a comprehensive, systematic legal code that was promulgated at a great, solemn assembly of the realm in 1140, and that represented a deliberate, self-conscious fusion of the Norman feudal custom, the Roman law of the Byzantine tradition, and the canon law of the Reformed papacy, a synthesis that was, in its intellectual ambition and its practical effectiveness, a model of the legal and administrative culture of the Norman state. The naval power of the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, which was, under the command of the great, legendary Admiral George of Antioch, transformed, in the space of a single generation, from a small, coastal patrol force into the most formidable and the most feared war fleet in the entire Mediterranean basin, was the essential, indispensable instrument of the kingdom's expansionist foreign policy. The weapon that enabled Roger II to project his power, with terrifying speed and devastating effect, across the entire, vast expanse of the Middle Sea, from the shores of the Maghreb to the walls of Constantinople, and to establish, for a brief, brilliant period, a Norman maritime empire that dominated the central Mediterranean and that challenged the naval supremacy of the Byzantine and the Fatimid fleets. George of Antioch, who was, in his origins, a Greek-speaking Christian from the Byzantine city of Antioch, a man who had served, in his youth, as a naval commander for the Zirid emirs of Africa before offering his sword, and his intimate, unparalleled knowledge of the Muslim and the Byzantine naval tactics, to the Norman king of Sicily, was the quintessential, cosmopolitan figure of the Hautevilles court. A brilliant, multilingual administrator and a fearless, innovative naval strategist whose career embodied, in its very trajectory, the multicultural, multi-ethnic character of the kingdom that he served. The fleet that George constructed and commanded was a masterpiece of naval engineering and tactical innovation, a force that combined the best elements of the Byzantine, the Arab, and the Latin maritime traditions, a fleet that was composed, in its core, of the fast, maneuverable, lateen-rigged galleys that the Normans had captured from the Saracens and that they had, in their own shipyards, continuously improved and expanded, but that also included, in its more specialized units, the heavy oar and sail-powered dramans that were the traditional warships of the Byzantine navy, and the large, broad-beam transport vessels that were capable of carrying the horses, the siege engines, and the supplies of the Norman land army across the open waters of the Mediterranean, a logistical capability that was, in the 12th century, a decisive, strategic advantage. The campaigns of the Sicilian fleet under George of Antioch, which unfolded over the course of the 1130s and 1140s, were a series of stunning, audacious, and often breathtakingly successful amphibious operations that redrew the political map of the central Mediterranean and that made the name of the Norman admiral a byword for terror and brilliance in the courts of the Islamic and the Byzantine worlds. The first, and the most strategically significant, of these campaigns was the conquest of the Zirid Emirate of Africa, the fertile, strategically vital region of the modern Tunisian coast, a series of amphibious assaults that began with the capture of the fortified island of Jerba in 1135, and that culminated in the capture of the great, ancient city of Mahdia in 1148. The capital of the Zirid emirs and one of the most important commercial and military ports on the entire African coast. The conquest of Mahdia, which was carried out with the characteristic lightning speed and tactical brilliance of George's fleet, was a political and a strategic earthquake, a victory that gave the Norman kingdom control over a vast, lucrative strip of the North African coast, and that established a permanent, Christian bridgehead on the continent of Africa, a dominion that was known, in the chanceries of Europe, as the Kingdom of Africa, and that placed the vital, trans-Saharan trade routes, with their immense, flowing currents of gold, ivory, and slaves, under the direct, controlling influence of the Sicilian crown. The subsequent, even more audacious, campaigns of the Norman fleet, the great, seaborne raids that George of Antioch personally led against the very heart of the Byzantine Empire, the sack of the wealthy, unsuspecting cities of Corinth and Thebes in 1147, and the even more daring, and more historically resonant, assault on the city of Constantinople itself in 1149, where the Norman galleys, anchored in the Sea of Marmara, fired a volley of flaming arrows into the gardens of the imperial palace. Were not, in themselves, campaigns of conquest, but they were demonstrations of breathtaking arrogance and theatrical flair, of the global reach and the devastating power of the Sicilian crown, a message, delivered with fire and steel to the Emperor Manuel I Comnenos, that the Normans, the descendants of the Vikings, were now the masters of the sea that the Byzantines had, for so long, considered their own, private, imperial lake. The cultural and intellectual flowering of the Norman Kingdom of Sicily in the middle decades of the 12th century, the extraordinary, unprecedented period of artistic patronage, scientific inquiry, and literary production that unfolded under the enlightened, cosmopolitan rule of Roger II and his sons, was a phenomenon that was, in its brilliance and its diversity, without parallel in the contemporary Latin West, a synthesis of the artistic traditions of the Romanesque, the Byzantine, and the Islamic worlds that produced a unique, hybrid civilization, a court that was, in the words of the chronicler Romuald of Salerno, a paradise of learning, and a mirror of the world, a place where scholars, artists, and scientists of every faith and every language were welcomed, protected, and generously patronized. The architectural monuments of this golden age, the great, glittering edifices that still dominate the landscapes of Palermo, Cefalù, and Monreal, are the most vivid, the most accessible, and the most breathtaking expressions of this unique cultural synthesis, a fusion of the Latin, the Greek, and the Arab building traditions that was, in its complexity and its beauty, an eloquent, silent manifesto of the multicultural identity of the Hautevilles state. The Palatine Chapel, the Cappella Palatina, which was constructed by Roger II within the royal palace of Palermo between 1132 and 1140, and which was consecrated, with immense, solemn pomp, on the feast of the Holy Apostles in the latter year, is the supreme, the quintessential monument of the Norman Sicilian style, a small, intimate, but overwhelmingly magnificent sacred space that combines, in a single, unified architectural and decorative program, the massive, Romanesque nave of the Latin Basilica, the central, domed sanctuary that is characteristic of the Byzantine Church, and the intricate, shimmering, wooden muqarnas ceiling, a masterpiece of Fatimid woodcarving that is, to this day, the largest and the most perfectly preserved example of its kind in the entire world. The walls of the chapel, which are entirely covered, from the floor to the apex of the dome, with a cycle of golden, glass mosaics that is, in its scale and its artistic quality, the equal of the greatest monuments of the Byzantine East, depict, in a series of vivid, hieratic panels, the full, majestic cycle of the Christian salvation history, from the creation of the world to the Last Judgment. A theological and political program that was designed by the king's mosaicists to project an image of the Sicilian monarch as the successor of the Byzantine Basilius, the divinely appointed vicar of God who ruled, with absolute, sacred authority, over the diverse, polyglot flock of his earthly kingdom. The Cathedral of Cefalù, which was founded by Roger II in 1131, as a fulfillment of a vow that he had made during a violent, perilous storm at sea, is a more austere, but equally magnificent, expression of the same royal, sacred patronage, a massive, Romanesque basilica whose soaring, apse mosaic, the figure of Christ Pantocrator, the all-ruler, gazes down, with a fierce, unblinking, and utterly majestic authority, from the golden, concave surface of the conch, a vision of the divine kingship. That was, in its political and its theological implications, a direct, visual parallel to the earthly kingship that Roger II was, simultaneously, constructing through his laws, his administration, and his armies. The cultural patronage of the Norman kings extended far beyond the sphere of architecture and the visual arts, encompassing a vast, ambitious, and remarkably successful program of scientific and geographical research that was, in its scope and its intellectual rigor, a direct, conscious emulation of the great, courtly traditions of the Abbasid caliphs and the Fatimid imams. A program that resulted in the production of the most important and the most accurate geographical treatise of the entire medieval period, the Book of Roger, the Kitab Roger, which was compiled, at the direct, personal command of Roger II, by the great Arab geographer and cartographer Abu Abdullah Muhammad al-Idrisi, a scholar who had been born in Ceuta, in North Africa, and who had traveled, extensively, throughout the Islamic and the Christian worlds, acquiring the vast, encyclopedic knowledge that he would, over the course of 15 years of labor, pour into the creation of his masterwork. The Book of Roger, which was completed in the year 1154, after a decade and a half of painstaking research, collaborative labor, and the systematic, critical interrogation of a vast, global network of travelers, merchants, and seafarers who were summoned to the court of Palermo to contribute their first-hand, empirical knowledge to the royal project, was, in its scope, its accuracy, and its profound, revolutionary methodological innovation, the greatest geographical work of the medieval millennium, a text and a set of maps that would remain, for over 3 centuries, the definitive, authoritative representation of the entire known world, and a testament to the extraordinary, enduring legacy of the multicultural, intellectually curious civilization that had been created, under the Hautevilles kings, in the heart of the Mediterranean. Al-Idrisi, who was a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad and who had been educated at the University of Córdoba, the most distinguished center of Islamic learning in the West, was a scholar of immense, encyclopedic erudition, a man who had mastered the entire, vast corpus of Greek, Latin, and Arabic geographical literature, but whose genius lay, not in the passive, uncritical repetition of the ancient authorities, but in the rigorous, empirical method that he applied to the collection and the verification of his data, a method that was, in its fundamental principles, a direct precursor of the scientific revolution of the early modern period. The king himself, Roger II, was, according to al-Idrisi's own detailed account, a deeply engaged, intellectually curious patron who took a personal, active interest in the progress of the work, who personally interrogated the travelers and the merchants who were brought before him, and who insisted, with the characteristic, practical rigor of his Norman ancestors, that the book should contain only that which was verified and reliable, the certain and the true, a directive that transformed the project from a mere, traditional compilation of lore and legend into a systematic, critical, and empirical investigation of the entire surface of the inhabited earth. The resulting work, which was divided into 7 latitudinal climes, following the classical tradition of Ptolemy, and which was accompanied by a magnificent, silver planisphere, a map of the world that was, according to al-Idrisi, engraved on a disc of solid silver that weighed over 400 pounds and that depicted, in astonishingly accurate detail, the coasts, the rivers, the mountains, and the cities of the entire known world, from the Pillars of Hercules to the distant, fabled shores of China, was a monumental, unprecedented achievement of collaborative scholarship, a synthesis of the geographical knowledge of the Greek, the Latin, the Arabic, and the Norse civilizations that was, in its comprehensiveness and its precision, without parallel in any of the individual, insular traditions that it had absorbed and transcended. The Book of Roger described, in meticulous, detailed prose, the physical geography, the climate, the economy, the political systems, and the customs of every region of the known world, a vast, encyclopedic survey that was, for the first time, based not on the abstract, theoretical speculations of the ancient philosophers, but on the direct eyewitness testimony of the merchants who had sailed the monsoon routes of the Indian Ocean, the pilgrims who had traversed the Central Asian steppes, and the Norse sailors who had penetrated, with their dragon-prowed longships, the frozen, fog-shrouded waters of the far North Atlantic, a convergence of global knowledge that was, in itself, a direct, tangible product of the unique, cosmopolitan environment of the Norman Sicilian court. The silver planisphere, the great, glittering map that was the visual centerpiece of the entire royal project, was, tragically, destroyed during the chaos of the baronial revolts that followed the death of William the Good in 1189, melted down, it is said, by the riders who plundered the royal palace. But the text of the Book of Roger itself, the Kitab Roger, survived, copied and disseminated by the scholars of the Arab and the Latin worlds, and it remained, for centuries after the fall of the Norman kingdom, the standard, authoritative geographical reference for the entire Mediterranean civilization, a silent, enduring monument to the extraordinary, multicultural, and scientifically advanced civilization that the Hautevilles kings had, for a few, brief, glorious generations, sustained on the island of Sicily. The religious policy of the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, which was, in its deliberate, pragmatic, and remarkably consistent tolerance for the diverse faiths of its conquered populations, a phenomenon that was entirely unprecedented in the contemporary Latin West, and that would be, in the later, more intolerant centuries of the High Middle Ages, viewed with a mixture of wonder, admiration, and deep theological suspicion, was not, in its essence, a matter of high-minded, liberal principle, or of a modern, secular conception of religious freedom, but a cold, hard-headed, and supremely successful strategy of imperial governance, a recognition, by the Hautevilles kings and their advisors, that the social peace, the economic prosperity, and the political stability of their realm depended, absolutely and irreducibly, on the accommodation of the large, wealthy, and indispensably skilled communities of Greek Orthodox Christians and Arabic-speaking Sunni Muslims who constituted the overwhelming majority of the island's population. The demographic reality of Sicily in the 12th century was a situation that no amount of brute force, no program of forced conversion or mass expulsion, could have altered without destroying the very economic and social fabric of the kingdom, a reality that the Norman rulers, who were, above all else, pragmatic and intelligent men of power, understood with a clarity that was, in the context of the age of the Crusades, profoundly exceptional. The Muslim population of the island, which was concentrated in the fertile, densely populated valleys of the west and the south, and in the great, ancient cities of Palermo, Agrigento, and Mazzara, was still, in the middle decades of the 12th century, a very substantial community, numbering perhaps a third of the total population. And its members included the most skilled and the most productive of the kingdom's agriculturalists, the expert hydraulic engineers who maintained the complex ancient systems of irrigation that made the Conca d'Oro a paradise of citrus and sugar cane, the most accomplished of the silk weavers and the metal workers of the capital, and the most experienced and the most loyal of the royal bodyguards, the Muslim archers and light cavalry who formed the core of the king's personal, military household. The Greek Orthodox population, which was even more numerous, particularly in the mountainous, northeastern region of the Val d'Amone and in the coastal cities of the mainland, was the living, continuous link to the Byzantine, imperial past of the island, a community that possessed its own, ancient, and deeply rooted ecclesiastical hierarchy, its own monasteries, its own liturgical language, and its own distinct and proud cultural identity, a population that the Norman kings, who were, after all, the sworn enemies of the Byzantine Empire, viewed with a certain, inevitable, political suspicion, but whose administrative skills, whose commercial networks, and whose naval expertise were, in the practical, daily operation of the kingdom, absolutely indispensable. The legal and the institutional framework of this religious tolerance was a complex, multilayered, and often contradictory system of privileges, protections, and obligations that was based, in its fundamental principles, on the Islamic concept of the Dhimma, the pact of protection that was granted by the Muslim state to the peoples of the Book, the Christians and the Jews, a framework that the Normans had inherited, in a pragmatic, selective fashion, from the conquered Kalbid emirs, and that they adapted, with their characteristic legal ingenuity, to the very different, Christian context of their own royal authority. The Muslims and the Greeks were permitted to worship freely, to maintain their own mosques and churches, to be judged according to their own religious laws in matters of personal status, and to participate, in varying degrees and with varying limitations, in the economic and the administrative life of the kingdom, but they were also subjected to a special, discriminatory tax, the jizya, which was the traditional, Islamic poll tax on non-Muslims, a tax that was, in the Norman context, a constant, humiliating reminder of their subordinate, conquered status, and a source of deep, simmering resentment that would, in the long term, undermine the stability of the very multicultural edifice that the Hauteville kings had so carefully constructed. The death of Roger II, which occurred on February 26, 1154, in his magnificent palace in Palermo, after a reign of 24 years that had transformed the Norman dominion in the south from a fragmented, embattled collection of fiefs into the most powerful, the wealthiest, and the most culturally brilliant kingdom in the Latin West, marked the end of the heroic founding era of the Hauteville monarchy, and the beginning of a new, more troubled, and more uncertain chapter in the history of the Norman state, a period that would see the kingdom, under the rule of his son, William I, known to history as William the Bad, and his grandson, William II, William the Good, continue to flourish, artistically and economically, but that would also witness the gradual, inexorable erosion of the political and the social foundations that the great king had so painstakingly constructed. William I, who ascended to the throne at the age of 34, was a ruler whose historical reputation has been, perhaps unfairly, overshadowed by the immense, towering figure of his father, a man whose character and whose abilities were of a very different, and considerably less impressive, stamp than those of the founder of the kingdom, but who, despite his indolence, his love of luxury, and his tendency to delegate the affairs of state to his powerful, ambitious ministers, was nonetheless a capable, if reluctant, military commander who successfully defended the kingdom against the most serious, external threat that it had faced since the imperial invasion of the 1130s. The external threat that confronted William at the outset of his reign was a new, and even more dangerous, coalition of the kingdom's enemies, a grand alliance that was forged, in the crucible of the papal curia and the imperial court of Constantinople, between the formidable, dynamic, and aggressively expansionist Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick I Barbarossa, the Byzantine Emperor, Manuel I Komnenos, and the Pope, Adrian IV, the only Englishman ever to sit on the throne of St. Peter, a triple alliance that was determined, once and for all, to crush the Norman upstart kingdom and to divide its rich, coveted territories between the two rival empires of the East and the West. The combined offensive, which was launched in the summer of 1155, was, in its initial, devastating phase, a catastrophic, near-fatal blow to the Norman kingdom, a campaign that saw the Byzantine general, Michael Palaeologus, and the rebel Norman barons of the mainland sweep through Apulia, capturing the great, crucial fortress of Bari, the old, Byzantine capital, and handing it over, with immense symbolic and strategic significance, to the Greek emperor, while the imperial army of Barbarossa, delayed by the rebellion of the Lombard communes of the north, prepared to march south, to complete the destruction of the Hauteville state. The response of William I to this existential crisis was the one, great, shining moment of his otherwise unremarkable reign, a demonstration of the latent, inherited strength of the Hauteville bloodline that astonished his enemies and that saved his kingdom from destruction. The king, who had, until this moment, appeared to be a passive, indolent figure, roused himself from his pleasures, assembled his loyal Saracen guard and the remnants of his Norman army, and marched with a speed and a determination that were reminiscent of his father, to confront the Byzantine and the rebel forces at the great, strategic crossroads of Brindisi, the ancient, Roman port that was the gateway to the east. The Battle of Brindisi, which was fought on May 28, 1156, was a shattering, decisive Norman victory, a battle that saw the combined Byzantine and rebel army annihilated, their leaders captured, and the captured city of Bari retaken in a brutal, exemplary sack that left the ancient capital in ruins, a punishment that was so severe and so terrifying that it extinguished, for a generation, the embers of the mainland baronial revolt, and that sent a clear, unambiguous message to the courts of Constantinople and Aachen that the Hautevilles kingdom, even under its weakest and most indolent king, was still a power that could not be challenged with impunity. The reign of William II, who succeeded his father in 1166 at the tender age of 12, and who would rule, with a mixture of genuine piety, ostentatious liberality, and a profound, enduring commitment to the architectural and cultural patronage that was the hallmark of his dynasty, for a period of 23 years, until his death, without a direct heir, in 1189, was the golden, autumnal sunset of the Hautevilles kingdom, a period of external peace, internal prosperity, and dazzling, artistic splendor that was, in its serene, untroubled surface, a deceptive, beautiful mask over the deep, structural fissures that were, even as the great cathedral of Monreale was rising from the rocky hillside above Palermo, steadily, inexorably, widening beneath the foundations of the Norman state. The young king, who had been placed, during his long minority, under the regency of his formidable, intelligent, and deeply ambitious mother, Margaret of Navarre, a woman of immense political skill and iron determination who was, in her own right, one of the most remarkable female rulers of the 12th century, was carefully educated in the arts of kingship, the languages of his diverse subjects, and the deep, sincere, and ostentatiously displayed Christian piety that would earn him, in the later chronicles, the epithet of the Good, a title that reflected not his political or military abilities, which were, at best, mediocre, but his personal sanctity, his lavish generosity to the church, and his profound, genuine love for the magnificent, sacred architecture that was the most enduring legacy of his reign. The foreign policy of William the Good, which was conducted, in the grand, sweeping tradition of his grandfather, Roger II, but with a very different, and ultimately less successful, set of strategic objectives, was focused, almost exclusively, on the complex, dangerous, and endlessly frustrating game of the Crusader states of the Levant, a theater of war and diplomacy that was, for the Norman kingdom, a constant, expensive, and ultimately futile drain on its military and its financial resources. William, who was, through his mother, a direct descendant of the great Crusader kings of Jerusalem, and who was the most powerful and the wealthiest Christian monarch in the Mediterranean, saw himself, with a sincere, if somewhat naive, piety, as the natural, divinely appointed protector of the holy places and the guardian of the beleaguered Frankish states of Outremer, a role that he pursued, with immense, ostentatious generosity and a complete, strategic failure, for the entirety of his reign. The great seaborne expeditions that he launched against the resurgent, Muslim power of the Ayyubid Sultan, Saladin, the expeditions that were supposed to relieve the pressure on the Latin kingdom and to recapture the lost territory of the interior, were, despite their immense cost and their impressive, logistical scale, a series of disappointing, inconclusive, and ultimately irrelevant diversions that failed to alter the fundamental, strategic balance in the Levant, a failure that was, in a bitter, ironic sense, a direct result of the very naval and military power that the Norman kingdom had, under Roger II, so brilliantly developed, a power that was, in the context of the Crusader states, a blunt, ineffective instrument that could harass the coast but could not penetrate, or hold, the inland desert fortresses that were the key to the control of the Holy Land. The great, lasting legacy of the reign of William the Good, the monument that would, for all time, be associated with his name, was not a military conquest or a diplomatic triumph, but a building, the magnificent, awe-inspiring Cathedral of Monreale, which the king founded, in 1174, on a rocky, sun-scorched hillside overlooking the Conca d'Oro, a few miles outside the walls of Palermo. A building that was, in its sheer, staggering scale, its breathtaking, golden mosaics, and its profound, symbolic fusion of the Latin, the Greek, and the Arab artistic traditions, the ultimate, the supreme, and the final expression of the Norman Sicilian cultural synthesis, a glorious, shimmering, and in the end, melancholic testament to a civilization that was, even as the last tesserae were being pressed into the damp plaster, approaching its inevitable, tragic end. The Cathedral of Monreale, which was consecrated, with the full, solemn pomp of the Sicilian court and the papal curia, in the presence of Pope Lucius III himself, on the feast of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary in the year 1182, was, in its architectural and its decorative program, the most ambitious, the most complete, and the most breathtakingly beautiful expression of the entire, unique, and ultimately transient civilization of Norman Sicily, a building that was, simultaneously, a royal mausoleum, a Benedictine monastery, and a powerful, visual statement of the absolute, sacred, and divinely ordained authority of the Hauteville monarchy, a statement that was, in the very moment of its completion, already beginning to be undermined by the deep, structural crisis of the succession that would, within a single decade, plunge the kingdom into chaos. The interior of the cathedral, which is, to this day, one of the most overwhelming, awe-inspiring sacred spaces in all of Christendom, is entirely covered, from the floor to the apex of the great, central apse, with an uninterrupted, shimmering cycle of golden, glass mosaics, a vast, comprehensive narrative of the Christian salvation history that extends over a surface area of over 6,000 square meters. The largest, and the most perfectly preserved, ensemble of Byzantine mosaic art in the entire world, a sea of gold and blue and crimson that depicts, in a series of vivid, hieratic panels, the entire, majestic sweep of the biblical story, from the creation of the world to the glorification of Christ in the celestial court of the Apocalypse. The political and the ideological program of the Monreale mosaics, which was carefully, meticulously designed by the king's theological and artistic advisors, was a direct, visual translation of the same, exalted conception of royal, sacred kingship that had been articulated, a generation earlier, in the great, mosaic cycles of the Palatine Chapel and the Cathedral of Cefalù. A conception that portrayed the Norman king as the successor of the Byzantine Basilius, the divinely appointed vicar of Christ who ruled, with absolute, unquestioned authority, over the diverse, polyglot flock of his earthly kingdom, and who was, in the famous, central panel of the apse, depicted in the act of being crowned, directly, by the hand of Christ's Pantocrator himself, a visual assertion of the divine right of the Hauteville dynasty that was, in its audacity and its theological ambition, without parallel in the Latin West. The secular, narrative aspects of the mosaic cycle, the scenes that depict the life and the achievements of the king, are a deliberate, carefully constructed piece of royal propaganda, a visual chronicle that portrays William II as the ideal Christian prince, the generous, pious patron of the church, and the powerful, victorious ruler who had extended the borders of his kingdom and who had humbled his enemies. A portrait that was, in its serene, confident, and utterly idealized vision of the royal power, a profound, and deeply poignant, contrast to the turbulent, chaotic, and politically fractured reality that was, even as the mosaics were being completed, beginning to unravel the kingdom that they celebrated. The royal mausoleum, which was constructed in the north transept of the cathedral, was the final, intended resting place of the Hauteville kings, a sepulchre of porphyry and white marble that was designed to house the tombs of the dynasty for centuries to come, but it is, today, a deeply moving, melancholy monument to the fragility of all human ambitions, for it contains only the sarcophagus of William the Good himself, the last, legitimate king of the Hauteville line, a man who died in November of 1189, at the age of 35, without a direct, male heir, leaving his kingdom to the chaos of a disputed, contested succession that would, within a generation, extinguish the Norman dynasty and deliver the great, glittering inheritance of Roger II into the hands of the German, Hohenstaufen emperors, a transfer of power that would, in the long, brutal, and bloody centuries of the Sicilian Vespers and the Angevin Wars, destroy the multicultural, tolerant civilization that the Hautevilles had created, and leave, as its only enduring legacy, the silent, golden, and eternally beautiful mosaics of Monreale, a testament to a world that was, even in the moment of its greatest glory, already, irrevocably, passing away. The death of William the Good in November of 1189, which occurred, with a grim, poetic irony, in the very palace of Palermo that his grandfather had constructed as the symbol of the Hauteville monarchy's universal, imperial ambitions, triggered a succession crisis of such profound, chaotic, and ultimately destructive proportions that it would, within the space of a single, turbulent generation, shatter the political unity of the Norman kingdom, extinguish the direct, legitimate line of the Hauteville dynasty, and deliver the great, glittering, multicultural inheritance of Roger II into the hands of a foreign, German imperial dynasty, the Hohenstaufen, whose rule would, in its turn, provoke the great, bloody, and historically convulsive revolt of the Sicilian Vespers, the event that would definitively, and permanently, sever the island from the mainland and mark the end of the medieval dream of a unified, Mediterranean Sicilian kingdom. The immediate, precipitating cause of the crisis was the absence of a direct, male heir, a dynastic vacuum that was, in the rigid patriarchal framework of the 12th century feudal monarchy, a recipe for chaos and civil war, a void that immediately attracted the predatory ambitions of the most powerful and the most ruthless rulers of Europe, who saw, in the sudden, unexpected vacancy of the Sicilian throne, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to acquire, through marriage, conquest, or guile, the richest and the most strategically vital crown in the Mediterranean. The legal, rightful heir to the throne, according to the feudal custom and the testaments of the previous kings, was Constance of Hauteville, the posthumous daughter of Roger II, who had been born, in 1154, a few months after her father's death, and who was, at the time of William's demise, a woman of 35 years of age, who had been, for 3 years, the wife of the most formidable and the most ambitious prince in all of Christendom, Henry of Hohenstaufen, the son and the heir of the great red-bearded emperor, Frederick I Barbarossa, a marriage that had been, from its inception, a deliberate, calculated act of dynastic politics, an alliance that was intended to reconcile the Norman and the German kingdoms, but that would, in the event, prove to be the instrument of the Hauteville dynasty's destruction. The claim of Constance was, in law and in custom, incontestable, but it was, in the brutal, misogynistic, and relentlessly pragmatic political culture of the Norman baronage, a claim that was almost universally rejected, a rejection that was based, not on any technical, legal defect, but on the profound, visceral aversion of the feudal nobility to the prospect of a female sovereign, and, even more importantly, to the certain, terrifying prospect that the crown, through Constance, would pass, upon her death or her incapacity, into the hands of her German husband, the son of the hated, imperial enemy who had, only a generation earlier, attempted to annihilate the Norman kingdom. The opposition to the Hohenstaufen succession coalesced around the figure of Tancred of Lecce, an illegitimate, but immensely capable and popular, grandson of Roger II, a man who had been born of an illicit, but long-standing and stable, union between Roger's eldest son, Roger of Apulia, and a noblewoman of the Lecce family, a bastard of the Hauteville blood who had, through his own considerable military and political abilities, established himself as the most powerful and the most respected of the mainland Norman barons, and who now, in the crisis of 1189, seized the throne, with the overwhelming support of the feudal nobility and the grudging, reluctant consent of the papacy, in a coup d'état that was, in its essence, a desperate, and ultimately doomed, attempt to preserve the Norman, Sicilian identity of the kingdom against the inexorable, rising tide of German, imperial power. The civil war that followed, the long, bitter, and devastating conflict that pitted Tancred, the last native Norman king of Sicily, against the combined might of the Hohenstaufen Empire, was a struggle that was, from its outset, a tragically uneven contest, a war that Tancred, for all of his courage and his tactical skill, could never hope to win, a war that devastated the countryside, exhausted the treasury, and fatally weakened the centralized, administrative structures that had been the proudest achievement of the Hauteville state, a war that ended, in February of 1194, with the sudden, unexpected death of Tancred, and the subsequent, swift, and utterly ruthless conquest of the kingdom by the Emperor Henry VI, who, at the head of a massive, triumphant army, entered the city of Palermo, and on Christmas Day of the year 1194 was crowned. In the great cathedral that Roger II had built, as the King of Sicily, a coronation that marked the final, definitive, and irreversible end of the Norman dominion in the south, and the beginning of a new, and far more troubled, chapter in the long, blood-soaked history of the island at the center of the sea. The Hohenstaufen interlude in the history of the Kingdom of Sicily, the half-century of German, imperial rule that stretched from the coronation of Henry VI in 1194 to the death of his son, the stupendously brilliant, terrifying, and ultimately tragic figure of Frederick II, in 1250, was a period of profound, violent, and transformative change, a period that witnessed the continued, dazzling cultural and intellectual flowering of the Sicilian court, which reached its apogee under the patronage of Frederick the Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, but that also saw the systematic, brutal dismantling of the last vestiges of the multicultural, tolerant social order that the Hautevilles kings had so carefully constructed, and the imposition, on the island, of a rigid, feudal, and increasingly intolerant Latin Christian regime. Frederick II, who was the son of Henry VI and Constance of Hauteville, the heir, through his mother, of the Norman blood of the Guiscard and Roger II, and the heir, through his father, of the imperial, universal ambitions of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, was a monarch whose character and whose reign embodied, in a single, extraordinary, and deeply contradictory figure, the dazzling, multicultural brilliance and the brutal, authoritarian darkness of the medieval Mediterranean world. He was raised, after the premature death of his parents, as a ward of the papacy, a lonely, brilliant, and intensely self-reliant boy who roamed the streets and the markets of Palermo, absorbing, with his prodigious, insatiable intellect, the languages, the sciences, and the philosophical traditions of the Latin, the Greek, and the Arab communities that still coexisted. In an increasingly tense and fragile equilibrium, in the city that had been the capital of the Norman kings. The court that Frederick assembled, first in Palermo and then, later, in his magnificent, personally designed castles of the Apulian coast, Castel del Monte and the Palace of Foggia, was the most brilliant, the most cosmopolitan, and the most intellectually audacious royal court of the entire medieval millennium, a place where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars collaborated, in relative freedom and under the generous patronage of the emperor, on the translation of the Greek and the Arabic scientific and philosophical texts, a program of cultural transmission that was, in its scope and its ambition, a direct continuation of the policies of Roger II, and that produced some of the most important works of medieval science, medicine, and philosophy. However, the political and the social order that Frederick established in Sicily was, in its fundamental character, a radical, brutal departure from the Hauteville model, a regime that was based, not on the pragmatic accommodation of the diverse, conquered communities, but on the absolute, centralized, and ruthlessly enforced authority of the imperial crown, a power that was exercised, not through the subtle, indirect instruments of the Hauteville administration, but through the blunt, terrifying force of the imperial army and the draconian, punitive legislation of the constitutions of Melfi, the great, codified body of law that Frederick promulgated in 1231, which established, for the first time in the history of the kingdom, a system of state-sponsored persecution and segregation directed against the Muslim and the Greek populations, who were, increasingly, viewed as a potential fifth column, a threat to the security of the Christian, imperial state. The forced deportation of the remaining Muslim population of Sicily, which was carried out, with immense brutality and immense logistical effort, over the course of the 1220s and 1230s, to the remote, arid, and isolated town of Lucera, on the mainland of Apulia, where they were confined, under strict military supervision, in a purpose-built, walled city that was, in effect, a vast, open-air concentration camp, was the final, tragic, and irreversible end of the multicultural experiment that the Hauteville kings had initiated 3 centuries earlier, a demonstration, of terrible, stark clarity, that the Norman vision of a society of pragmatic coexistence had been, in the crucible of the Crusades and the rise of the persecuting state, definitively and permanently extinguished. The great, convulsive, and historically decisive uprising that is known to history as the Sicilian Vespers, the massive, coordinated, and extraordinarily violent rebellion that erupted, with the sudden, volcanic force of a long-suppressed, pent-up fury, in the city of Palermo on the evening of Easter Monday, March 30th, of the year 1282, and that, within a few weeks, spread like a wildfire driven by the hot, sirocco wind, across the entire island of Sicily, was the event that finally, definitively, and permanently shattered the political unity of the Norman and the Hohenstaufen kingdom, and that redrew, in a single, bloody, and irrevocable stroke, the political map of the Mediterranean world. The immediate, precipitating cause of the uprising, the spark that ignited the tinderbox of Sicilian resentment, was, according to the vivid, dramatic, and deeply patriotic accounts of the contemporary Sicilian chroniclers, a seemingly trivial, but deeply insulting, incident that occurred during the evening service of Vespers at the Church of the Holy Spirit, a small, unassuming sanctuary that stood just outside the walls of Palermo, on the edge of the great, royal park of the Favara. A group of French soldiers, the hated, arrogant troops of the Angevin king, Charles I of Anjou, who had conquered the kingdom from the Hohenstaufen heirs in 1266, and who had established, in Palermo, a brutal, exploitative, and deeply resented regime of foreign occupation, were, according to the chronicle, harassing and insulting the Sicilian women who were attending the service, an act of casual, routine brutality that was, on this particular evening, met not with the customary cowed submission, but with a sudden, explosive eruption of popular fury, a cry of "Maranelli Francesi! Death to the French!" that was taken up, in a swelling, contagious roar, by the entire, gathered crowd, and that signaled the beginning of a slaughter that would, within hours, engulf the entire city and, within weeks, the entire island. The French garrison of Palermo, which was taken completely by surprise by the sudden, ferocious, and universal nature of the uprising, was overwhelmed and massacred, the soldiers hunted down in the streets, the officials dragged from their offices and their palaces, and the hated, Angevin administration, the entire, elaborate apparatus of foreign, oppressive rule, was, in the space of a single, terrifying night, utterly and irrevocably annihilated, a sudden, violent, and complete destruction. That was, in its speed and its totality, without parallel in the history of the medieval world. The rebellion, which was, in its origins, a spontaneous, popular explosion of rage, was quickly, and skillfully, exploited by the Sicilian nobility, the great, landowning families who had chafed, for decades, under the Angevin yoke, and who now seized the opportunity to take control of the revolution, to channel its energies, and to provide it with the political and the military leadership that would be necessary to resist the inevitable, and ferocious, counter-offensive of Charles of Anjou, who was, at that very moment, preparing, in the ports of Naples and Marseilles, a massive, punitive expedition that was intended to crush the rebellion and to reduce the island to a state of permanent, submissive terror. The diplomatic masterstroke that transformed the Sicilian Vespers from a doomed, local rebellion into a successful, permanent revolution, and that ensured the long-term, political survival of the island's independence, was the decision of the Sicilian leaders to offer the vacant crown, not to any of their own, fractious, native barons, but to the most powerful and the most determined enemy of the Angevin kingdom. The King of Aragon, Peter III, who was, through his wife, Constance, the granddaughter of the great, tragic Emperor Frederick II, and who thus possessed a legitimate, dynastic claim to the Hohenstaufen inheritance, a claim that he was, for both political and personal reasons, eager to press. The Aragonese intervention, which was launched, with a formidable fleet and a battle-hardened army, in the summer of 1282, was a decisive, strategic turning point, a move that transformed the conflict from a local, Sicilian rebellion into a full-scale, Mediterranean war between the two great, rival maritime powers of the Latin West, a war that would, over the next 2 decades, exhaust the resources of both kingdoms, and that would, in its final, negotiated settlement, the Peace of Hautevilles, in 1302, permanently, and definitively, severed the political link between the island of Sicily and the mainland kingdom of Naples, a division that would persist, with profound, lasting consequences for the history of the Italian peninsula for the next 5 centuries. The long-term consequences of the Norman conquest of southern Italy and Sicily, and of the subsequent, turbulent, and ultimately tragic history of the kingdom that the Hautevilles brothers founded, extend far beyond the political and the military narrative, reaching deep into the economic, the social, the legal, and the cultural structures of the Mediterranean world, and leaving a legacy that is still, to this day, visible in the architecture, the languages, the genetic makeup, and the collective, historical memory of the peoples who inhabit the Mezzogiorno and the island of Sicily. The most profound, and the most enduring, of these legacies was the transformation of the religious and the ethnic map of Sicily, a transformation that was, in its essence, the final, definitive, and irreversible triumph of Latin, Roman Christianity over the Greek Orthodox and the Arab Muslim civilizations that had, for so long, contested the dominance of the island at the center of the sea. The Norman conquest, which was, in its initial phase, a remarkably tolerant and pragmatic undertaking, a rule that accommodated and even, in some respects, protected the Greek and the Muslim communities, was, in its long-term, historical trajectory, the instrument of a vast, slow, and inexorable process of Latinization, a process that was driven, not by the deliberate, genocidal policies of the early Hautevilles kings, but by the powerful, underlying forces of demographic migration, ecclesiastical reform, and the gradual, cumulative pressure of the feudal, Latin right aristocracy that the Normans had introduced and that, over the course of the 12th and the 13th centuries, steadily, relentlessly, displaced the older, indigenous elites. The Greek Orthodox Church, which had been, at the time of the Norman arrival, the dominant, established Christian confession of the island, was gradually, and in the end, forcibly, subordinated to the Latin hierarchy, its monasteries suppressed or converted, its bishops replaced by Latin prelates, and its liturgy, its theology, and its deep, ancient connection to the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople systematically, and often brutally, extirpated, a process of ecclesiastical Latinization. That was, by the end of the 13th century, almost complete, and that left the once proud, Greek-speaking communities of the Val de Mon reduced to a small, scattered, and culturally marginalized remnant. The Muslim population of the island, which had, under the early Norman kings, enjoyed a degree of protection and a measure of autonomous, communal existence that was, in the context of the crusading age, extraordinarily remarkable, was, in the end, subjected to a fate that was far more catastrophic, a process of progressive, cumulative persecution, of punitive taxation, of forced conversion, and of military deportation that culminated, in the reign of the Hohenstaufen Emperor Frederick II, in the final, tragic, and complete expulsion of the last Muslim communities from the island, to the distant, isolated exile of Lucera, on the mainland of Apulia, where they would, eventually, in the year 1300, be massacred, in a final, terrible act of genocidal violence, by the orders of the Angevin king, Charles II, a brutal, definitive end to the 4th-century history of Islam in Sicily, an end that was, in its savage, systematic finality, a stark, terrible testament to the ultimate, tragic failure of the multicultural, tolerant vision of the Hautevilles kings. The cultural and the artistic legacy of the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, the great, shimmering, golden monuments of Palermo, Cefalù, and Monreale, and the vast, encyclopedic scientific and geographical works that were produced, under the generous, discerning patronage of the Hautevilles court, by the scholars of the Latin, the Greek, and the Arab traditions, is a legacy that transcends, and that, in a profound, philosophical sense, refutes the tragic, bloody narrative of the kingdom's political decline and its eventual, violent extinction, for these works of art and of intellect, which have survived, with a remarkable, stubborn resilience, the earthquakes, the wars, and the centuries of neglect and decay, are a permanent, enduring testament to the extraordinary, unique, and in the end, tragically transient civilization that the descendants of the Vikings created on the island of Sicily. The architectural and the mosaic art of Norman Sicily, which fuses, in a single, breathtakingly beautiful, and entirely original synthesis, the massive, fortress-like Romanesque of the Latin West, the ethereal, golden, and hieratic splendor of the Byzantine East, and the intricate, geometric, and infinitely patient decorative craftsmanship of the Islamic Mediterranean, is, to this day, one of the most important, the most studied, and the most visually overwhelming artistic ensembles in the entire world, a body of work that has been, since the 19th century, a site of pilgrimage for artists, architects, and scholars, and that has been, since 2015, inscribed, under the collective title of Arab Norman Palermo and the cathedral churches of Cefalù and Montreal, on the UNESCO World Heritage List, a recognition of its outstanding, universal value to the common, shared heritage of all of humanity. The intellectual and the scientific legacy of the Norman kingdom, which is embodied, most vividly, in the great, silver planisphere of al-Andalus and in the magnificent, illuminated manuscript of the Book of Roger, is a legacy that was, for centuries, one of the primary conduits through which the advanced, scientific and geographical knowledge of the Islamic world was transmitted to the Latin West, a transmission that was a vital, essential, and often overlooked factor in the great intellectual reawakening of the 12th century, the period that is known, in the traditional historiography, as the Renaissance of the 12th century, a period that laid the intellectual and the institutional foundations for the universities, the scholastic philosophy, and the scientific revolution of the later Middle Ages. The Norman Kingdom of Sicily, therefore, was not a mere, exotic, peripheral curiosity in the grand, sweeping narrative of European history, a brief, bizarre episode of multicultural tolerance in an age of crusading fanaticism and religious persecution, but a central, vital, and profoundly influential player in the great, complex, and deeply interconnected drama of the medieval Mediterranean. A kingdom that, for a few, brilliant, and ultimately tragic generations, demonstrated, with a dazzling, concrete, and breathtakingly beautiful certainty, the extraordinary, creative, and transformative potential of a civilization that was willing to embrace, to synthesize, and to transcend the rigid, sectarian boundaries of the age, a lesson that, in the troubled, fractured, and increasingly intolerant world of the 21st century, still resonates, with a profound, melancholy, and deeply urgent power. The saga of the Normans in Italy, from the first, tentative arrival of the landless, desperate, and ferociously ambitious younger sons of the Cotentin Peninsula, to the dazzling, multicultural apogee of the Kingdom of Sicily, and through the long, tragic, and bloody centuries of its decline and its fragmentation, is, in its vast, sweeping arc, one of the most extraordinary, the most dramatic, and the most profoundly instructive chapters in the entire, long, and often violent, history of the European continent. We have followed the footsteps of the Hautevilles brothers, those towering, indomitable, and utterly ruthless giants of the 11th century, as they carved their fiefs, with the edge of the sword and the cunning of the fox, from the decaying, demoralized remnants of the Byzantine and the Lombard states, and we have witnessed the astonishing, meteoric rise of Robert Guiscard, the cunning, the man who, from a bandit's lair in the barren, rocky mountains of Calabria, rose to challenge the emperors of the East and the popes of the West, and who laid the foundations, in a lifetime of relentless, brutal, and unceasing warfare, of the duchy that his heirs would transform into a kingdom. We have marveled at the patient, methodical, and profoundly intelligent state-building of Roger II, the grandson of the Guiscard, the king who, in a single, brilliant, 24-year reign, forged the most centralized, the most prosperous, and the most culturally sophisticated monarchy in the Latin West, a realm that was, in its official, trilingual documents, its multi-ethnic, multi-religious bureaucracy, and its magnificent, syncretic art and architecture, a living, breathing, and for a brief, glorious moment, a stunningly successful refutation of the intolerant, exclusivist ideologies of the crusading age. And we have contemplated, with a sense of the profound, tragic irony that is the very essence of the historical perspective, the slow, inexorable, and ultimately catastrophic unraveling of that great, multicultural experiment, a process that was driven, not by the external, military threats that the kingdom so successfully resisted, but by the internal, structural contradictions and the deep, unresolved tensions between the Latin, the Greek, and the Muslim communities that the Hautevilles kings, for all of their pragmatic genius, could never, permanently, resolve, and that, in the end, consumed, from within, the brilliant, fragile civilization that they had created. The legacy of the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, the silent, golden, and eternally beautiful testimony of the Palatine Chapel and the Cathedral of Monreal, the vast, comprehensive, and staggeringly accurate geographical treatise of al-Andalus, and the enduring, if fading, memory of a time when the descendants of the Vikings, the sons of the conquerors who had sacked Seville and Luna, created, in the sun-drenched, contested island at the center of the Middle Sea, a court where the scholars of 3 continents and 3 religions could meet, in a spirit of mutual, if often grudging, respect, and collaborate on the great, collective project of human knowledge, is a legacy that continues to inspire, to challenge, and to haunt the imagination of the modern world. Thank you for joining me on this epic journey through the rise and the fall of the Norman Kingdom, a story that, in its ambition, its brilliance, and its ultimate, tragic fragility, captures, with a rare and a powerful clarity, the complex, contradictory, and eternally fascinating nature of the human adventure. If you have enjoyed this exploration of the Viking spirit transformed into Mediterranean kingship, please press that like button, share this video with a fellow history lover, and subscribe to the channel, ringing the bell, so you never miss an episode of Stories of Our History. Let me know in the comments which saga of conquest and cultural fusion you would like us to uncover next. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.